When the boundaries of the world are broken, horrors and fantasy are manifested by those who have the power of souls. Souls and the mind are connected, so wherever powerful souls are found, the dreams and delusions of those who inhabit the lands are made manifest. This is the world of demon souls. This video, like all others on the channel, is sponsored by my game Snails Have Skeletons. To support the work I do here, I hope you'll click the link in the description to wishlist it on Steam in order to help it in the recommendation algorithm there. I am AesirAesthetics. Grab yourself a cup of coffee and let's dive in. It's easy to take the presentation here for granted because so many games have come and gone which have been influenced by this one, but this scenery was not indicative of the average fantasy action RPG at the time. And it's easy to forget how different the organic first impression might have been. Most of us kinda knew we were in for a hard and different kind of game when we heard about this one and tracked it down, but if you're one of the people who went in blind at release, this might have been a real shock to the system. You put the disc in and watched the menu cinematic, then started playing, and the world being so dead and dreary might have struck you as odd. And the emptiness might as well. The menu cinematic had more going on than anything in the game actually does. So the introductory moment for a lot of people might have been more stark back in 2009 than it is today when every other action game kinda sorta looks like this. On the level design, the geometric layout here in the opening is pretty straightforward for this game, with the encounters being fairly isolated in distinct rooms and hallways connecting to one another. There's not a lot of exploration to be done, and there also isn't a lot of bleed over for encounters. Each room is designed around the action it's training you to do, and when you've been taught the fundamentals, you get to fight the Vanguard demon boss, die, and go to the Nexus. Pretty straightforward, all things considered, but because this is the tutorial, that doesn't mean the same thing it might if this was part of the mid-game. What is and is not quality design can be contextual, so moving forwards, I'm going to try and frame the evaluations around a couple of things. First, what is the area in question setting out to do? Second, does the area succeed in that ambition? My own personal feelings and obsessions will bleed into the video a lot, and there's more to the evaluations than just these questions, but it's worthwhile doing this exercise because even if you disagree with my takes, at the very least it's a somewhat fair, grounded, and understandable framework. So, the tutorial. Its purpose is to teach the players the basics of the game, and it uses the tried and true method of telling the player what to do with those text messages on the ground you toggle to read, and then having the player perform the action. Not groundbreaking stuff, this is about as Game Design 101 as it gets, and on a first glance the tutorial doesn't have much more to offer. Gameplay-wise, the purpose of this place is to drill in the fundamentals beyond and above delivering a particularly satisfying experience in its own right. If Boletaria 1.1 was the tutorial level and it was structured similarly to the training grounds we have, text messages teaching inputs, sealed off rooms for experimenting with the mechanic the room is meant to be teaching, etc., then Boletaria 1.1 would probably have suffered because so much fundamental stuff would be front-loaded into every run until you beat the first boss. Demon Souls is very deep and there's a lot of room to express yourself with these mechanics, and backseating that experience behind having to retry the opening however many times it takes you to clear the first boss would no doubt hurt your enjoyment, since those who fall in love with this game tend to fall in love with it because of the depth. Gameplay-wise, the journey to the Nexus is here to make sure the player knows how to play the game. Story-wise, it's here to justify the player's first death in the narrative. Upon death, we are linked to the Nexus and return to life over and over again. I made a whole video about the cycles of samsara in these games, which you can check out if you want to see me elaborate on that idea. I can't fault this place on anything, but if we're going to be rating it, we need to see if it goes above and beyond in any ways, and there are two in which I think it does. First, Demon Souls' world is incredibly layered, and the more you dig into it, the more you begin to make connections with interesting ramifications. Often, that's the brain filling in gaps and maybe imagining depth that wasn't intentionally placed there, but often, those connections reveal the ideas undergirding the entire game. For example, this is ostensibly a dark medieval fantasy game, but in the tutorial, there's some Roman architecture. Behind the medieval world, there's an older world that still persists in some capacity, and it connects to the cyclical narrative about the soul arts, because we know that long ago there was another civilization which went through what is happening in the game when we play it, and endured after paying a great cost. It's interesting to think about how the remnants of that world still linger in the periphery of this one, and it's very understated, all things considered. Another thing I like about the opening is how it primes the player for the experience to come. The entire game is structured around completing levels and defeating bosses to unlock progress, so having that be the tutorial with lower stakes and more simplified encounters is a good touch, as is the presentation of atmosphere and attitudes in the journey to the Nexus. The overarching emotion which comes through to me from the Demon Souls experience is despair, and the tutorial does a good job of presenting that feeling. It also correctly primes the player for understanding what kind of gameplay this is, not just in the nuts and bolt mechanics, but in the design principles of encounters. This is an easy gauntlet, but it still disincentivizes rushing ahead and places an emphasis on situational awareness above all else. So, in every conceivable way the tutorial introduces players to the Demon Souls experience, it does a great job. You can't skip it when you start playing the game, but I never have, which speaks to how highly I think of this opening. Moving forwards, FromSoft would eclipse what they did here with, for example, the Northern Undead Asylum, but since we're restricting our evaluations of these levels to the specific game in question, and since so much of what makes subsequent games is dependent on the experimentations done here and the work done to build on top of this game, it's almost unfair to give this tutorial a lesser placement, only because later a better one was made. For what it is in the context of this game, for what it sets out to do, and for how much it accomplishes, especially considering its short duration, I'd give it top marks. S tier, even. Moving on to the Nexus. Since it's the central hub of the game, the layout and function is different from everywhere else we visit in the game, and we need to evaluate things a bit differently from how we just did. The intent here is not to provide combat encounters or to tap into your brain's risk versus reward center to amp up the tension in the gauntlet. It's to be a middle spot between all exploration, it's to funnel you into more organic encounters with the NPCs, to nudge you towards engaging more with the story, it's to offer quiet time in between the gauntlets, and it's to make it so that you don't need to constantly go back to an older world and navigate through some section of it if all you want is to meet a specific NPC or vendor or trainer. The layout is fairly straightforward, with the first floor being where NPCs, for the most part, are found, and the archstones are interacted with to access the levels. Above, you meet the monumental, but all in all, there's not a lot going on here in the layout of the place outside of how uncanny it all comes together. There are no windows to the outside, and the entire space is designed around an otherworldly aesthetic when compared to the rest of the game. Demon Souls is remarkably grounded in its fantasy because in lore, the magic that is tearing the world apart is a relatively recent phenomenon. So when we travel around the game world and explore, the actual architecture we see for the most part isn't relying on you suspending disbelief and imagining that magic made that place. The Nexus is the sharpest point of difference in this regard, and like how the tutorial primed the player for the sort of experience they can expect to have, I think the Vanguard demon from there and the out-there look of the Nexus help cement early on that there is more going on here than in your typical medieval fantasy game. The game is called Demon's Souls, so demons are to be expected, but the nature of demonhood isn't as straightforward as evil creatures that escaped hell to hassle mankind. The line between human and demon is questioned, and the nature of man and his cruelty and malice is a massive revelation towards understanding what the Old One actually is. The Nexus is where a lot of those revelations are made, and its out-there visual style helps bridge the more conventional medieval action game environments with the deeper, darker, more heady contemplative stuff, because once you've been here for the first time, it makes sense to dig deeper into the rest of the locations and encounters because you know there's more going on than what it might look like on first glance. On NPC story progression, because the Nexus is revisited so often, slight changes get more mileage than they would if this wasn't the hub. Something as small as where a character is sitting being different from last time you met them might be enough to get your attention and push you to engage with them. The fewer elements, the less changing up of the scenery is required for the players to notice. Remember PT? Remember the hallway? That obviously wouldn't have worked if the playable space was scaled up to an entire library or manor. Before directing Demon Souls, Hidetaka Miyazaki had been at work in the Armored Core Mines, and if you play the 4th gen games he worked on and then head on over to Demon Souls, you see a change in the presentation when it comes to contextualizing interfaces because here, they are characters. So, in Armored Core, you had a shop to purchase new parts, here you have vendors. In Armored Core, your purchased items were stored for you, here there's an NPC who exists solely to store items you aren't using. In Armored Core, you had a garage to customize and improve your mech, here you have the Maiden in Black to level you up. In Armored Core, you had briefs from characters you never met which came in to give context to the happenings in the story as they unfurled, here you need to search that stuff out. Aside from item descriptions, the game presents almost all of the story in environmental context clues and in you encountering characters who can give you insight to the happenings. These are radically different kinds of games, so different approaches to presentation are to be expected. And the major one is the Nexus. The Raven's Nest equivalent from Armored Core 4 was just an interface screen. Here it's a magical location which is lodged in between every instance of you wanting to engage with the characters. It's not as fast or optimized as the Armored Core system was, but speed isn't the point. Engaging with the characters is, and because you have to do that more, you will pick up on more things they have to say about the world and its makeup and conflicts, which can help frame your experience. If it isn't obvious, I think the Nexus is great, both as a level and as a hub. S tier, even. Boletaria 1-1 is the first real gauntlet in the game, and it begins the Boletaria trend of having challenges be relatively straight shots from beginning to end, but there being obstacles preventing you from the direct path. Here, the gate to the Phalanx boss is straight ahead from spawn, but it's closed, so you need to do a left and invade the castle interior to eventually open up the gate. This gauntlet is quite lengthy and embraces some of the best practices for encounter design the game's focus on situational awareness can bring out. I'll elaborate on everything I'm discussing here when it becomes relevant again later on in the video, but because the combat mechanics of Demon Souls are as primitive as they are, the scenario direction of enemy combat encounters is doing the heavy lifting of carrying the combat. The moveset is all very delayed and enemies deal a lot of damage, so there's a nudge towards reactivity in combat. To not go straight ahead, but to delay yourself and be patient, all baked directly into the moveset, and the encounters take advantage of this as well. A guiding mantra which helps attune you to how to best approach this game is that almost every encounter can be overcome and all damage avoided if you think ahead. The need to make the encounter and level design shine because of how primitive the combat is, in no small part, is probably why the item and enemy placements in Demon Souls has an artistry on par with the best survival horror games ever made. Subsequent FromSoft games rely more on enemy AI and elaborate movesets to make encounters engaging, so their placement isn't highlighted as much. There's also much deeper combat mechanics in subsequent games, so you can often get around the encounter configuration by brute forcing your way through with strong attacks and weapon arts that undermine the challenge. That isn't the case of better or worse, it's preference. Demon's Souls was my first Souls game, and the semi-survival horror mechanics are largely what attracted me to it, and so I always like these games the most when they lean into that. Since combat is never as disempowering an activity in subsequent games as it is in this one more than the others lives and dies by its quality scenario direction, which, and I'm repeating myself, is some of the best which any video game has ever accomplished. This is the absolute gold standard. It's got a better grasp of this than Resident Evil 4 or Snake Eater. That's how ridiculously good the game is. And the more you dig into this, the more examples you can point out. For example, items. The items in these games are very underutilized by the player base, and fair enough, the weapons are enough to trivialize encounters by themselves, but if you pay attention, there's usually a lot of thought placed into where you find things. Here in Boletaria 1-1, we are introduced to the firebombs, and then the room which immediately follows has two enemies throwing them at the player to make sure they know what this item is. The hoplite enemies are well defended and placed in such a configuration that reaching their weak spot, there behind, requires some finicky movement. But if you carry some of the fire bombs with you, they can mitigate the entire encounter. There's also turpentine here to give weapons a fire buff, and both of these items are valuable and well kept in mind for when it comes time to deal with the phalanx boss itself. Aside from her, there are entire rooms in this place which a well-placed firebomb can clear out by itself, and the coolest thing of all is that none of this is mandatory. You can sword and shield your way through all of these encounters, but engaging with the space in a deeper way and internalizing and strategizing and thinking things through here is almost always rewarded, which makes progress feel so much more rewarding. Another good scenario direction moment in 1-1 is how scaling to the top of the castle ramparts has us have to dodge a rolling boulder trap. And then, later on, we can activate one of those ourselves to clear out a line of enemies. The best moments in video games always come from an encounter or revelation or emotion which was carried by the mechanics and framing.
Do you guys remember that sequence in Resident Evil Remake with the flooded basement? After draining the water, the giant shark insta-kills you if you get too close. So, you would have to zap him only for the game to then ask you to walk past the mouth of the shark to loot an item on the other side. That was a great and tense moment. The perception of danger is completely justified, so dangling progress in front of the players like that, enticing them to risk it all, makes for a very tense scenario. Anyways, Boletaria 1-1 has an area where a couple of dragons rest, and underneath them are a bunch of useful and valuable items, like the Ring of Flame Resistance or the Purple Flame Shield. It is sort of the meme in the community that most players, and I'm not excluding myself from this, will hoover up everything until they find a big sword to bonk their way through the rest of the challenges. But if you replay the games with the mindset of using what you have at your disposal and what the game gives you in the sequences wherein you find yourself, more than likely you'll discover how carefully considered the enemy and item placements were and how much artistry there is in the scenario direction. Speaking of artistry in the direction, Boletaria 1-1 is slotted into the game as the first real gauntlet, and there is no leveling up available until you've cleared this place. You can get stronger here by picking up the Cling Ring and increasing your max HP, and you can maybe find a better weapon. But the chief way in which your growth as a player happens here on your first run, if you are having a trouble with the area, is you coming around to the game's expectation that you will take it slow and think things through. If you could grind your levels right at the start, you might try that before giving the challenge here all you have, because grinding is the path of least resistance. And if you did that, you would not be engaging with the challenge the way it was intended, and the learning experience would be diminished. If that mindset were rewarded here, you might bring it with you in tackling the other zones and never pick up on the central premise of the encounter design in this game. However great a game is, if it teaches the player to play it incorrectly, the experience suffers. But here, because player growth is so hampered this early on, progress is practically locked until the player has had it drilled into their heads that this is a game of situational awareness and not trial and error. The tutorial taught you how to play, Boletaria 1-1 teaches you how to think about playing. Now, let's discuss runbacks and how they feed into this. The creative choice to have the player lose their held souls when they die affects what a gauntlet needs to facilitate. If you kept your held souls on death, then each run you could theoretically teleport back to the Nexus and level up, making each subsequent run easier. But because souls are lost, the expectation shifts away from gradual building up of numeric strength and more towards the gradual building up of mechanical mastery and patience as you sort through the environmental clues to what's coming up ahead. Losing everything on death, and also having your health halved, and also not recovering the healing materials you used to get through for free, and also having the world tendency shift to make the challenge harder, means each run has you pick up more knowledge of placements of enemies and traps, but in spite of gaining this knowledge, subsequent runs can be riskier than earlier ones since the run back has so much more on the line. Because leveling up is locked away here in the beginning, this observation will be more relevant for later sequences, but even here the punishment for death matters outside of the resources because of player psychology. People get attached to their progress, and when it's represented with a numerical figure, souls increasing, seeing that figure go down hurts.
Whether or not losing 2,000 or 3,000 souls in the first hours matters all that much in the grand scheme of a full playthrough. A knock-on effect to the approach which was taken towards scenario direction is that, for the overwhelming most part, when players die, they know they could have avoided it if they'd have done one thing differently. There are sacky deaths in every game, and those are more frustrating in a game with consequences for death that are as extensive as they are here in Demon's Souls, but aside from those rare occasions, death feels like a personal failure. In triumph and defeat, Demon's Souls grants the player ownership of their progress. To mitigate the potential problem of players disinvesting themselves from the game after failing enough times, there are permanent Boolean changes which you can affect in the game. For example, opening up shortcuts and cutting out entire map segments from subsequent runs. That means that even if you continue and die after unlocking the shortcut, some manner of progress is preserved. And any amount of progress actually could be set to accomplish this. Like getting a better weapon, a stash of souls for upgrading, not applicable here because leveling up is not accessible until defeating the Phalanx boss, but still worth noting since the rule applies everywhere else until the ending. If you think about how progression design was handled in, say, the old Megaman games, that's pure memorization and skill. You'd get further with a run there by remembering the minutiae of where platforms spawn, where enemies are located, where dangers and safety is, what the best timing to tackle obstacles are, and by having a tight grasp of what Megaman can reasonably do. Also, since those runs are sequence shiftable, you could always bring in a power-up earned by clearing one map to help make another one easier for yourself. But the feeling of progress in those games is in your learning of routes, mechanics, placements, and layouts. Megaman does grow, but not within a level, such that the next go-through of it will be easier. Enemies will respawn, checkpoints are not respected, shortcuts don't open up. Demon's Souls, comparatively, is much more forgiving, even in spite of the many punishing mechanics it has going for itself, and Megaman did not. Now, Megaman did have full-on game over screens, which would scrub all of your progress, so there's that, but Demon's Souls has things like wall tendency, soul form, depreciating resources, loss of XP, etc. And the reason Demon's Souls is more forgiving in spite of creative choices like these is that you can always improve yourself or the run on the margins. You can grind to upgrade your character to have more passive defenses, making each run objectively easier. Megaman doesn't have that. You can open up shortcuts to circumvent having to replay large sections of the levels. Megaman doesn't have that. So, Demon's Souls might be thought of as a more forgiving game, but remember that Megaman also doesn't have the run back quite the same. Yes, you do need to retry when you fail there, but the investment in a run is purely the time you spent on it. In Demon's Souls, you can recover from failure, which you cannot do in Megaman because Demon's Souls has growth from each run. Collected souls, which you can reclaim if you play carefully and skillfully enough, whereas Megaman does not. If we compare the two head-to-head, Megaman's runbacks are crueler and less forgiving than Demon's Souls' are, but it doesn't necessarily feel that way, because Demon's Souls stacks so much more lost progress behind each failure, which you can mentally compare to the games having tangible progress that sticks around from run to run in the form of level-ups and shortcuts. In Megaman you died and you need to retry. In Demon's Souls you died, and you need to retry, and also you need to figure out where you're gonna get your health from, and also you didn't get the shortcut, and also you lost your souls, and also you didn't find a better weapon, and the layout is kinda complicated, so you're not even 100% sure you know where you were when you died, and also you could have retreated before dying and cashed in your souls for level ups, but you didn't, and that choice sticks with you. Demon's Souls feels crueler because it has all of these difficulty relief valves for you to ruminate on, whereas Megaman does not, and so failure doesn't have as many variables to juggle. Stack them side by side and Megaman is clearly crueler, but it doesn't feel like it. And to the player, that's the only thing that matters. How it feels. The Phalanx boss is a souped-up hoplite enemy in that those guys used a shield to protect their vulnerable bodies, and the Phalanx uses the hoplites to protect herself. Any tactic you picked up on dealing with these guys in the preceding gauntlets will be useful fighting them here, and the thinking behind how they were placed in the gauntlet seems to return. You'd often find these guys in darkness, such that when you get close they'd seem to appear out of nowhere. The Phalanx boss arena is pretty darkly lit, and because there are so many of these guys around, it's kinda hard to keep track of all of them at once, so you can, during the fight, stumble into an ambush because you didn't see the entire field properly and rolled into darkness without getting a clear view of it first. It's not always the case that a given boss is an amplified repurposing of a mechanic or challenge that was in the preceding gauntlets, but there are enough examples of this strewn about that we can be fairly sure it was intentional. I like this fight. Mobs in boss fights often get a bad rap in these games. The combat system is built around the one-on-one, and when mobs are strewn around, it makes it harder to go all out since you have to keep an eye out to not get flanked or surrounded. Since we're all situational awareness appreciators here, we take those challenges when they're given. In summary, Boletaria 1-1 is among the best zones in the game. Easy S tier. Boletaria 1-2 might be the most straightforward area in the entire game, absent the tutorial and the ending. It's a gently curved path across castle ramparts with periodic towers for safety from the fire-breathing dragon. There's also the underground section, which is safer to traverse than timing the runs through the dragonfire on the ramparts is. This place is unique in that the majority of it is a gimmicky challenge, and the conventional gameplay, dungeon crawling, is reserved for the smaller underground path. If we return to the topic of boss runbacks for a bit, it's interesting how, while this is among the easier levels in the game, once you get the timing right and the confidence to go ahead with your runs, it might be disproportionately responsible for player deaths because of how instant dying here is if you get caught by the dragon. Screwing up in an encounter is usually something you can remedy by healing or rolling to safety, but here, it's all or nothing. Since this place is such a straight shot from beginning to end, I'm going to talk about player direction. You won't find this tight player direction anywhere else. For one, Boletaria 1-2 doesn't have routes going nowhere, so provided you are moving forwards and not backwards, you are making progress. Also, the dragonfire behind you nudges you towards the end goal. If you stand still in a tower and look at the periodic dragon swoops, it starts looking a bit artificial, but who cares? It's an in-universe mechanism for signposting the correct heading, and not that setting something up makes something inherently good, but this dragon did appear and do the fire-breathing thing in Boletaria 1-1 as well. So it even expands on an earlier challenge. That this is done with an in-universe phenomenon, and not by tacking on to the universe some sort of quick and dirty signposting, yellow paint, heh, is a mark of quality level design. When the Resident Evil 4 Remake demo came out and I made my video on yellow paint and signposting in response to the backlash, many did not take what I said very well. Fair enough, I came across as a bit of a prick, and I was admittedly talking a bit out of my field of expertise. I stand by every point I made there, but I was not aware of how pervasive the yellow paint problem had become. I haven't been actively playing AAA releases since the PlayStation 3 days, so to me yellow paint still meant yellow pipes and signs to signpost navigation in Uncharted. But when people were complaining about the yellow paint, they were complaining literally about yellow paint in so many games where genuine tricks for player direction would be feasible and preferable. On one hand, yellow paint is easy and solves the issue. On the other hand, it's very, very ugly, and ugly is a problem when your game is largely sold on graphical fidelity. You might say that's a case against an insane push for realistic graphics, but since that's not a conversation gamers want to have, instead they disparage the yellow paint as signposting. And you know what? Fair enough, you can have these graphics without this wishy-washy and uninspired signposting. It just requires thinking outside of the box, and the development pipelines of massive games where the actual labor is split up between studios and contractors just might not allow for that. The simplest solution is to use more diegetic means of signposting. So, if you've ever gotten lost in Blighttown, know that the ladders are always signposted with a torch. If Sekiro's grappling mechanic scared you from playing that game, unlikely, but go with it, rest assured that every grapple point will have a green circle overlaid on the HUD to signpost its presence, and that ledges you can grab a hold of from jumping from heights are signposted with those grey-brownish scratches underneath them, and chalkline texture at the actual edge face itself. The physical act of moving a 3D shape through 3D geometry is made simpler when elaborate movement is shorthanded like this. Yes, you could make a game where the objective was the complexity of the movement and the challenge was in how to move the 3D object, player character, through the various geometric challenges, but FromSoft doesn't make platformers, they make action games. And so complicated movement is never really the point. There are times when movement is dangerous, and that's the challenge, but the movement is not actually complicated. What it is high risk and high commitment to every input. When movement ranges towards complexity, like grappling in Sekiro, it's shorthanded. You don't need to perfectly aim the grapple hook in Sekiro with an aiming reticule, just point the camera in a direction and the game will select the most appropriate ledge or branch or whatever to grapple onto. Armored Core 6 has elaborate movement, but Armored Core 6 is not Armored Core 1, where actually moving the mech was often a bit of a hassle, and good gameplay was often less down to how smooth the mech moved, and more down to how you overcame the clunky movement by smartly placing the mech in the map. Armored Core 6's movement, comparatively, is so smooth that you can have face-to-face one-on-one duels with other mechs even when you're both zooming around at insane speeds. Complex movement is smoothed out for the sake of not overwhelming the player, because complex movement is not the point. Sekiro's grapple expands the mobility options, but it requires nothing more than aiming the camera, a skill every player will need to have to even play the game in the first place, and pressing the grapple button when a target is available. Like all mobility options, this does change the best practices for designing a level, however much or little, and in Sekiro it meant too many grapple points in a small vicinity can have those grapple points be in competition with one another, so good discipline would have been to not stack too many competing ones close together. Or not stack any competing ones, for that matter, which is often the way Sekiro does it. Also, I said point the camera, but it's enough to have the grapple point in view and be close to it. It's not reticule aiming, the game handles finding a target for you, like the auto-aiming in the Jack games. Action platformers, not games about angling the camera while hiding behind cover. Auto-aiming shorthands combat and lets you fight without sacrificing mobility. Let's bring it all back now. In Demon's Souls, movement is as simple as we'll find it in any modern FromSoft game. Aside from maybe Derasane, haven't played it. We do have the Vault, which will be dropped in many subsequent titles, but Dark Souls 1 will add a jump, and whatever depth was lost with losing the vaulting is more than made up for with the inclusion of the jump. So movement here doesn't need to be shorthanded or supported with AIs that smooth out complex geometric collisions. The benefit of a simple movement scheme is that, like the combat, it puts the burden of spectacle on the scenario direction. Here, that's the map layout, the art style, and signposting. There's an in-universe signposting tool in the All Guides of Guidance. From a distance, these lit-up stones look a bit like the item glow, which we're conditioned into wanting to loot. So not only do they show headings, they can make you want to go there. There's also more elaborate signpostings for headings, like the Dragonfire here in Boletaria 1-2, which, as I noted earlier, moves in one direction, and so nudges you forwards at all times. Another point on signposting, and this is more of an anti-point, when interfacing with a system or a game, players develop schemas to help them navigate the space. If you've ever seen a poorly designed program where it feels like you're banging your head against the thing, often it's that the system is too complex for the primitive shorthand schema you're applying to navigate it, or that the system does not have a cohesive adherence to that schema, and so the disciplines you picked up that worked in earlier parts break down without the schema being elaborated on because the new components you needed to internalize were not explained to you or presented in a way that you'd intuitively pick them up and adapt the schema to fit them. Demon's Souls' movement does not get more complicated than it was at the very, very beginning of the game, and aside maybe from the swamps in Valley of Defilement 5.2, and even then, the rules for movement aren't broken anywhere in any sense, so this isn't an issue we'll be bringing up at any point, but it's worth pointing out because this can be an issue in other games. Like, if a game had breakable crates, but around the halfway point, all of a sudden those crate models were used in environmental clutter and were not breakable. You'd still try and break them, and you'd ask yourself why the game is changing the rules on you like that. It'd feel bad. And I call it an anti-point because it's one of those things that might not be obvious to implement, but when it's not there, players definitely feel its absence. But Demon's Souls is very solid on this. The schema you develop in the tutorial is broad and encompassing enough to get you through the entire game without much modification. Rewinding back to the beginning of Boletaria 1-2 for a moment, I love the Hoplite enemy. They are a perfect distillation of the enemy design in this game. That is, the actual fights are very easy, the challenge is in situating yourself for success. The hoplites carry a big shield blocking damage from head-on, so the challenge when fighting them is positioning yourself on their sides or back to actually deal significant damage against them. And hey, since we're talking about the enemies here, I like the underground sequence and how enemies will ambush you from the dark. This is something we've not seen as much from in recent From games, partly because they overhauled the darkness, so it's never quite as dark as it is here, but having enemies jump you from shadows where they are hard to detect is fun. Makes you slow down and keep your eye out. If it wasn't obvious, I give this level an S tier ranking. Also, it's maybe the only time clutter really matters in this game, because you have to weave around it when running across the ramparts to avoid the dragonfire. If nothing else, Boletaria 1-2 is a great showcase of how to make something as straightforward as a hallway very expressive. Stonefang 2-1 is set in a mine, so its layout features narrow corridors, burrows, and the like, but those are often contrasted with paths wrapped around expansive open spaces. The biome is fully embraced in the level and encounter design. Enemies throw rocks, there are molten iron or lava fields, and like how Boletaria introduced fire bombs and turpentine, and enemies weak to that, here the Stonefang miners have stone scale skin, which is hard to penetrate, but early on you can loot sticky white stuff and get a magic buff to your held weapon. Stonefang is my favorite of the art stones in the game, and it's not so much because of the individual areas here, but because of how they come together around a specific idea. That is, when you start exploring in the first Stonefang zone, you enter the mine and are surrounded by brickwork, elevators, machinery, miners, and fat official overseers, etc. But in Stonefang 2-2, you see a bit less of this industrialism and more burrows made by the bearbugs. The technology you stumble across becomes cruder and cruder until you reach the very bottom, where you fight the Flame Lurker in a hole leading to the Dragon God. The further you go into Stonefang, the more you leave the material world of men behind and embark upon nature forces and fantasy. The storytelling technique in these games is famously based on Miyazaki's own experience with Western fantasy books as a kid, where he couldn't understand all the words, so he filled in the gaps himself. Instead of directly telling, the narrative has already occurred, and we mostly have pieces of the wreckage to look at to try and postulate what might have gone on. The story is all there if you search for it, but the attitude of these games is that since you're playing as a guy in the world, there's no reason you'd be privy to every secret and mystery the world is hiding. This makes a lot ride on the environmental storytelling, but Demon's Souls is ever opaque about things, so mostly the environmental storytelling in question is a corpse with maybe some item on it. Go wild theorizing with that one. I've explained my theory for the nature of the magics and horrors which are afflicting the world of Demon's Souls before, but it wouldn't hurt to go over it again since it's relevant to the story told with this level. We learn in the menu cinematic that when God gave men a soul, they gained clarity. We also know that God placed the Old One in the world to feed on souls. On a first glance, it might appear that this was done out of malice, but the more I've looked at the demons and the conflicts in the game, the more I'm not convinced that's the case. People in this world become demons seemingly when they accrue a great enough mass of souls. Likewise, a great enough gathering of souls can spawn a demon independent of any human being being physically there, because souls are influenced by the mind, people's beliefs, so the horrors that appear in the world might be seen as physical manifestations of people's beliefs rather than objective reality. It is because people believe in evil that the soul arts manifest as evil. In Stonefang, there is the legend of the legendary Big M and the dragons, and so when we fight the bosses, it's the legendary Big M and the Dragon God. Not necessarily real historical creatures, but rather representations of people's beliefs in these stories brought to life by the power of souls. This is what I think is being hinted at with the Beast Talisman and Sage Freyk's revelation, that the voice of God that Saint Urbane hears is actually the Old One, and that the miracle and magic systems use the same mana pool confirms that they are the same thing, being filtered through different belief systems. So I don't think the horrors of the soul arts manifest as despair inherently because the world is evil, but rather because people lust after the power of each other's souls as a byproduct of consciousness. And God chose to not strip people of consciousness. Instead, he created the Old One to punish mankind should they ever indulge themselves in the souls of their fellow men. I'm not saying it's a direct reference, but I think it shares a lot of similarities with the idea of evil from Berserk in this regard. Evil exists because people believe in it. But if people believed in goodness, then goodness could manifest instead. Tying this back to Stonefang 2.1, the transformation of the miners into actual brainless stone-scaled slaves could be because of a belief that was embraced here. It could also be that the transformative properties of ore, which they are surrounded by at all times, grabbed onto them and changed them. Point is, we're watching the malleability of the boundaries of the world owing to the soul arts. FromSoft has explored this idea more often than probably any other across their modern licenses. In Bloodborne, Old Blood was how the boundary of life was blurred and the transformation was horrific or glorious. It just depended on the person's own innate insight. If it was low, they'd succumb to lowly beasthood. If it was high, they could ascend to become great ones. In Dark Souls, the order of the world was undone by Gwyn to perpetuate his age, and the horrors that manifested in that world are all downstream of this corruption to the natural flow of things. Sekiro's central premise seems to be that immortality is parasitic. Every instance of it we see in that game comes at the expense of feeding on the lives of others, and the more it is pursued, the more Ashina rots. I've talked about this in other videos, so channel regulars should be well familiar with my thoughts on this stuff by now. Tying this back to the level design of Stonefang 2.1. The reason Stonefang is my favorite art stone is because it has this exploration through time and the contrast of the early industrialized mining compared to the later, more naturalistic primitive tunnelings. Individually, none of these places rank as my top picks, but together they come together around this idea. And Stonefang 2.1 goes out of its way to immerse you in the ways in which the soul arts corrupt the world, but from men. So the clutter is all industrial machinery and anvils and shelves, human environments. But the conditions here are not conducive to human prosperity. This is a slave mine, after all, and it's cool how we see the ways in which the corruption of the world flows from the function of the place. The competing and contrasting interpretations of the idea of what to expect from a mine level we see in the entire Stonefang ordeal, from first warp all the way to the Dragon God, are also cool. Very varied. After unlocking the gigantic elevator shortcut here, you also unlock Ed as a blacksmith. The Nexus made it so that players no longer needed to travel to the worlds for the interfaces like storage, weapon upgrades and repairs, purchasing, etc. So Ed, and later on Grave Robber Blige, are notable because their function in the game is primarily to act as vendors, and they are located early in the game, near the Nexus warp points, so that the player doesn't need to spend a lot of time traveling to meet them. Ed is a blacksmith. Blige sells healing grass, among other items. If there's a game design purpose to them, I figure it's that if the player murder hobos, they're Nexus vendors, he has backups. But I think these characters are actually designed more so to add flavor to the world. Stonefang is a mine, so it makes sense to have an actual blacksmith guy here. Shrine of Storms is a catacomb, so it makes sense to have a grave robber character there. If we evaluated the layouts and enemy encounters in Stonefang, there's a lot to appreciate. I noted the placement of the sticky white stuff, but it also has fun ambushes in tight spaces, and it has good enemy placements, like the Fat Officials. This enemy is tanky for the early game, so to take him out you need to sustain the assault for a bit. The challenge is in how his attacks can rapidly put you close to death, making the prolonged encounter a bit more stressful, and also in how his fire projectile attacks happen to have an interaction with the exploding barrels, which this enemy is frequently surrounded with. I talked about the principles behind good enemy encounters for specific enemy types a bit when we were discussing Boletaria, but something I did not discuss then, which was relevant there and here, is in-level fog walls. This is a practice which FromSoft has mostly dropped outside of boss arenas, but having the path ahead blocked by one of these fog walls is a good way to build up some anticipation. It blocks visibility moving forwards, and it prompts progression as a choice the player must make in the interface and not solely in the geometry. There isn't much of a functional difference between opening a door and walking through it and crossing a fog wall. Both have you press a button and end with you crossing a gap of some kind, but they feel very different, and like I've already said, the feeling is what matters more than the reality of the experience. There's also a bit of a guessing game with the fog walls. If this was a boss, you'll be locked in that encounter, so you get to math that out in your head and stress a bit about progression. An incredibly cheap but effective way of adding some prominence to the risk versus reward of progression, making the player more tense for a bit. As boss runs have become less and less central to the experiences in these games, moments like the one I'm describing where you actually stop and slow down to get your bearings and calculate the risk of advancement have diminished. And so tricks like the fog wall, even when they are used in later titles, don't have the same effect, on me at least, as they do here, since those later titles very rarely will have as much progress on the line as a given run in Demon's Souls will. Moving on to the armored spider boss, I do think it can be a bit cheap, because it utilizes webbing to slow down the player's movement, and up until this point, there had not been any hint of such a mechanic existing in the game. The room prior to fighting the armored spider has webs in it, so you could easily imagine a mandatory web the player must walk through, which slows them down for a few seconds to teach the player about this mechanic before having the player encounter it in the middle of a boss fight where not knowing about it and having it afflict you is enough to doom a given run. It's not a massive issue, and I don't think it undermines all the good stuff which the armored spider has going for itself, but I figured I'd bring it up. The spider, like most Demon's Souls bosses, is designed to be a strategic encounter more than a skill challenge, so the actual fight is fairly primitive, and the burden of spectacle is on the clever application of level design. It's a tight hallway where you need to dodge projectile attacks from the spider, and for the record, fire attacks were seen in Stonefang 2-1, the Fat Officials remember, so them being present in the boss fight here shouldn't be a surprise. Also, they will clear the webbing if you're hit with them, which is a nice touch. The goal here is to make it to the armored spider, deal some damage, and then when the spider starts spewing fire, retreat back to the hallway and then make your way back to it again, rinse and repeat until the boss is defeated. Stonefang 2-2 has an important choice front-loaded in the map. Right at the start, there are two paths, left and right, the player can go, and while both lead to the Flame Lurker boss, they lead you to him in very, very different ways. It's a descent to get to him, and one path takes you through elevators and tunnels and cliff faces, the other has you carefully drop down wooden platforms jutting out of a massive hole. So there are two ways to progress. One involves engaging with the core dungeon crawling challenge of incrementing your way through the environments and overcoming the enemies, but the other is a quicker path that has a much lower tolerance for failure because death is instant. This is the most extreme forked path in the game, but it's by no means the only one. Boletaria 1-2 had this going on as well. The underground passage there was completely optional, time every run correctly, and the Dragonfire will never hurt you. And like in Stonefang 2-2, the path choice is also a gameplay choice. Demon's Souls dungeon crawling, or a less forgiving path which is faster. Go underground or run through the Dragonfire. A lot of the game's gauntlets feature a forked path in some capacity. And like the fog gates I just went over, this makes progress a choice. Not feel like a choice, like the fake fog walls did, but a real choice, which the player gets to make and live with the consequences of. The risk versus reward part of Demon's Souls' experience, in this case progress or retreat, is much more present minute to minute than it would be in all subsequent games, and touches like forked paths create choice moments that expand on the times the player gets to make that calculation. Something I like about the wooden platform sequence here is how extended it is. Once you start dropping to the lower floors, you cannot climb back up. And also, the challenge isn't done when you time it right, like the Boletaria Dragon or later the Latria Ballista. You have to keep going, and any misstep is almost certainly death. Something this does for runbacks is risk locking dropped souls in a location which is executionally hard to get to regardless of held items. So if you die on the left path and have to make your way back there to where your stuff is, provided you have resources, the ask isn't that great. But there's no mitigating factor for the platforming sequence here. Having healing resources is good because falling does damage, but a slight mistake is all it takes to lose everything. You save a lot of time if you succeed on the execution challenge paths, but the commitment required to run them is much steeper than the more conventional dungeon crawler paths. On the dungeon crawler path, the left path, it is a good time to talk about camera systems. Demon Souls' camera is fairly non-intrusive and doesn't have many elaborate bells and whistles attached to it. It's a lot like the combat system in that regard, and like the combat system, the best use cases for the camera are not found by looking at the camera, but the way in which the world layouts take advantage of the presentation it provides. So, the dungeon crawler path of Stonefang 2.2 has a lot of sequences where you break line of sight to any orientation device. You have tight burrows and tunnels that have a slight curvature to them. You have a rotation of interiors and exteriors which break up continuity from area to area and help extend the world in your head. All of this is to say, because you don't get a good look at the environment in its totality and are constantly making tiny adjustments to the camera placements, you can lose track of its eventual facing direction relative to where it was at the start, and when you find yourself looping back to see or enter a previous segment of the map by organically exploring a path, you might be a bit surprised by how turned around you've gotten.
Dark Souls has been praised for this often in regards to, say, the routing to the Moonlight Butterfly, or more notably, the elevator from Undead Parish to Firelink Shrine.
Those moments of, wait, how did I get here, are accomplished by these subtle forced reorientations of the camera, compounding to get your heading all disoriented. Compare the showing here to Boletaria 1.2, where your heading was clear from the beginning, and you never had to question your relative location in the world, and then think about how conforming to your main heading the camera placement was all throughout. That gauntlet was going for something different than this one, so different approach, you know the deal, but it's still an interesting comparison, and the dungeon crawling sequence here is a great showcase of disorienting the player by taking advantage of the passivity with which players mentally track the camera. Flamelurker isn't the most polished boss in the game, but like I went over, I think the story of the legendary Big M, which might be Flamelurker considering we find M's Hands of God outside the Flamelurker arena, and how the Flamelurker uses punch attacks, and considering how he emerges from a mural statue deal in the wall of the entrance to the Dragon God arena, legendary Big M killed dragons in myth, I think there's enough things there surrounding the boss even if the fight is kinda weak. Also, a poor boss isn't enough to drag down Stonefang 2.2, which otherwise has so much going for itself. The Dragon God's boss arena is one of, if not the largest boss arenas in the game. After entering, the goal is to clear rubble that blocked your path, to fire the ballistas, to get those spears into the Dragon God to immobilize him for the kill, all the while avoiding the boss's attacks. Now, I am going to give the encounter here the critical eye it deserves, but before I do, let me ask you a question. How many boss arenas in Elden Ring mattered? How many of them would you say had character and were distinct to fight in, versus how many of them were open spaces which facilitated the execution challenge of the bosses? Demon Souls' approach to boss design is the same as their approach to enemy encounters, and again, it all comes down to a more primitive system, not facilitating a great encounter in a vacuum, and so the actual scenarios needed more specialized attention paid to them. Yes, the Dragon God can be a bit sacky, but people talk about this as if this is somehow a horrendous and unforgivable drain on the experience, instead of an encounter that just feels a bit half-baked. The Bed of Chaos, this is not. Also, I feel like the people who hate on this boss might do well to try and take it slow instead of trying to rush it, like we are nudged to engage with almost every other encounter in the game. Maybe the presentation urges haste and that disconnect is why people try and rush it, in which case, I guess I could fault the game, but then again, the game up until this point has been prioritizing patience and restraint even in the bosses, so why the impulse to change it up here should be on the game and not the player, when the game has been very upfront all throughout about what is and what is not a viable mentality to progress, I would put into question. For the analysis we're doing in this video, we do need to look at the bosses somewhat, since the intent of the environmental layouts is to facilitate the encounter with the boss, and because I've already been fawning over scenario direction and enemy encounter design, it wouldn't exactly be fair to drop that part of the equation now when it might make the rating look bad. Still, in as gentle a way as possible, I would like to make a separation between the two when it comes to evaluating where the failing is at. Because there's nothing about the physical geometry of this place or how it communicates direction to the player or facilitates movement that I can seriously fault. The only issue with the boss is that the attacks aren't telegraphed super clearly. But then again, if you take it slow and map out where he attacks instead of trying to rush, the issue sort of disappears. If anything, Dragon God's failing is that, for as much of a spectacle as it is set up to be, it's just not very engaging. And I would wager that the boss we have is very different to the boss they initially planned to have. Now, rewinding a bit, because I talked about the changes to how these games approach designing boss arenas. In Demon's Souls, the minutiae of the geometric layout matters in a way it doesn't constantly in subsequent FromSoft games. As FromSoft made more and more games and elaborated on the mechanics from here, the challenge in the boss fights veered away from situational awareness, as the case is here, and towards timing windows and execution challenges. For those, a relatively large open space is preferred because even the slightest geometric clutter can wrap a fight up in seconds if that fight is all about rolling in the right direction. With Tower Knight earlier, the challenge built on the challenge established in the run to the boss, where archers would try to shoot you when you were trying to make it to the towers where you could stop and be safe while timing your routes through the Dragonfire. For the Tower Knight, you are shown in the cutscene that the archers are there and they attack you relentlessly while fighting the boss. He is relatively easy if you go at it in the correct order, taking out the archers first. Both they and the Tower Knight have ranged attacks, but the balconies where the archers stand are more protected than the Tower Knight's pit is, so archers go first. I know this isn't like the most profound thing in the world, but I like to emphasize it because the bosses here, for the most part, rely on the arena layout for spectacle. None more so than Dragon God, perhaps. Having seen this concept revisited with the Old Iron King, with the Guardian Serpent, I'm not gonna say there's nothing to improve on here, but I also don't agree with the general consensus that this fight isn't worthy of the game or that it's a massive stain on it. I find it's a boss that's about as easy as you have impulse control. For all of the hatred he gets, you are allowed to not run into his fists. Also, there's good cliff action here, and there was some of that in Stonefang 2.1 and 2.2, and I'm a sucker for that stuff. Latria 3.1 has a distinctly different progression layout from previous gauntlets because this place branches out and back to base and then out and towards the boss. It's a multi-story prison with tight walkways patrolled by mind flayers who can fire stun-locking projectiles and then move in for the kill. They can also project force attacks that knock everything in close vicinity away in case you bridge the gap to them and don't finish the kill quick enough. Probably they are the most sophisticated enemy in the game, even though they are fairly simplistic when you lay it all out. It's all in how the behaviors congeal to the experience, you know. Latria is the horror sequence, and it goes without saying that 3.1 is an easy S tier, if any location FromSoft has ever designed is an S tier. I can think of maybe 3 they've done since, which are better made. This is so good. When asked, most people will likely attribute atmosphere to why Latria 3.1 is so powerful, and I agree, that's a strong component, but I've maintained for as long as I've made videos on Demon's Souls that the actual trick is in the clever utilization of the healing mechanics in this one. Channel regulars know what I'm about to say, so I'll keep it brief. There's no lootable healing items in Latria 3.1, so the tension gets more and more amplified with every step you take, because your resources are always going to be depreciating. You can buy them from the former royal's wife, but even that does kinda play on the same amplifying tension as the lack of lootable grass does, because you're committing resources to the progression. The way this all plays out is that you spawn in, explore, maybe loot some keys, open some cells, fight some enemies, take risks, and all the while, the resources you need to keep yourself going are depreciating. The Mind Flayers are such a good enemy for a gauntlet that's more about tension and horror because of their ability to basically insta-kill the player. So much can go wrong quickly and it makes every encounter quite tense. The further you explore, the more keys you loot, the more you can open up the rest of the place to explore. The tension cycle for each Mind Flayer engagement is the same. You hear and notice them, you confront them, you go in for the kill, and after they're dead, the tension releases. But in the background, the tension for the Latria 3.1 experience as a whole is constantly hitting higher and higher peaks, because every time you overcome an enemy, you make more progress that is on the line, while the difficulty release valves are not giving you release in all cases. Around a third or so of the way through this place, you have to double back to the opening to open up a new sequence, and once you have, an entire floor is cut from the run. At that point, you could warp back to the Nexus, cash in your held souls, and stock up on supplies for the rest of the gauntlet, but after this one deviation from perpetually escalating tension, there will not be any organic release. From this point on, the tension cycle only goes up. And it doesn't help that the different floors here all follow the same basic layout, so it's easy to get disoriented and lose track of where you are and where you died if you died. The same camera disorientation technique that worked in Boletaria 1.1 that I talked about in Stonefang 2.2 is at play here. Considering how there's no release for the tension cycle in 3.1 until either you clear it or you die, it's interesting to consider the inclusion of the Queen Ballista, because this is the path forking moment. And like the other ones I've discussed so far, you have a short execution challenge with a massive penalty for failure offered up as an alternative to more conventional dungeon crawling. It's fairly deep into the gauntlet, so the tension is high when you reach it and decide to go for it, and it takes you straight to the Fool's Idol boss. Also, it's a one-time thing. If you clear the bridge, or you reach the other end of the bridge from the dungeon crawling path, you can shut the ballista down and the bridge just becomes a regular shortcut. I discussed the Mind Flayer and how much I like the design of that enemy, but I also like the prisoners. The prisoners aren't really a threat, but they swarm the tight hallways once you open up their cells, so you can make navigation harder on yourself if you were too eager to loot. That's a different kind of punishment from the usual affair. Your curiosity is piqued, and by opening the cells, you make navigating the place harder for yourself. Opening up the Iron Maidens sometimes drops a corpse to loot, but there's also dangers lurking in there. It does betray the standard schema of exploration, which the rest of the game uses, but this is the horror sequence, and it comes out so strong that I can't really hold that against Latria. Over-eagerness is also punished in the boss fight. This is one of those bosses that's an amalgamation of the entire gauntlet that preceded it. First, the arena has church benches cluttering it, and making navigation trickier, there's prisoners in the arena which can get in your way. There are stun-lock traps strewn about, and like the Mind Flayers did, the boss shoots the player with projectiles. The gimmick that she endlessly revives if you don't deal with the reviver guy on the upper floor is good or bad, depending on how much tolerance for pain you have. I feel it's on brand for Latria to be that cruel, to have you overcome the boss and then learn that, nope, it's not over yet, but I can see people finding it frustrating. Not frustrating enough to undo the greatness of this place, but frustrating still.
What do you want?
I brought Latria up a lot in my Madness of FromSoft video, which I'd recommend watching if you have been enjoying this one, and something this place does differently in the whole Soul Arts manifest the beliefs of the people in the world department is that the beliefs of the people are used to torture them. So they believe in salvation from their queen who will come from above and raise the deserving up from their suffering. The ballista has her likeness, but mows down those who try to cross the bridge to reach the queen in the church. The Fool's Idol boss has her likeness as well, but is a false idol. Those who ascend above are raised by the demon gargoyles and not by angels, and not to salvation, but to a place that's even more sinister than what we have here in Latria 3.1. Latria 3.2 eases up on the healing drop restriction from 3.1 and is also a much more straightforward challenge layout-wise. No branching paths, no intersecting routes, aside from the shortcut back to the start at the very end. There are slight tangents here and there, paths that lead to loot and not much else, but aside from the gauntlet needing to vomit the player out near the start, at the end, there's no reason this place couldn't have been a straight line all the way through. The path, for the most part, is an elevated walkway with no guardrails and enemies which are flying gargoyles. They have large bodies and can effectively block off paths when grouped together and do ranged damage. So there's a lot of opportunity here for dying from falls, and the combat has enemies close off sections of the map with their bodies and challenge you to reopen them. Also, because there's no guardrails and hardly any clutter on the walkways, there's not a lot of protection from the projectile attacks, so you need to keep an eye out. Doubly so considering how dark the place is. Once you get to the lower section, the Blood Swamp, navigation and combat become much easier. It's nice looking, it plays well, and it adds variety to Latria 3.2 that otherwise it would almost certainly be in desperate need of. Because of how linear and on the rail the experience here is, cognitive load is stressed mainly with darkness and combat. When a player makes a choice, in this case when navigating and exploring, it takes a bit out of them, and the more choices a player is asked to make, the more overwhelmed they gradually become. Not only in keeping track of their relative location and how to get back there, though that is there, but also just in general. Making choices, big or small, drains mental energy. In exploration, in every gauntlet we've discussed so far, this has been embraced, intentionally or not, and has fed well into the risk-reward thing. Pushing ahead is a choice, retreating is also a choice. Having come however far you have in a given run nudges you to want to keep going, but it also burns you out a bit. There are ways to mitigate that, and in every gauntlet we've discussed so far, aside from maybe Boletaria 1-2, because that place was so straightforward, there's generally been a lot of choice moments for path retreating, or visual variety within a given gauntlet to overcome this a bit. But still, every turn and every forked path is a choice, and each choice taxes. So for Latria 3-2, which is the darkest area in the entire game, visually speaking, and also is quite enormous, the utilization of the choice economy is inverted from how it usually operates, with there being very few alternate paths to explore, and none which take you particularly far. The challenge here isn't in the complex layout. Actually, if you lit it up, this might be the most straightforward sequence in the entire game, beside maybe Boletaria 1-2 and the beach at the very end. No, the challenge is visual information. You don't have entire sections of the map in view at all times, so piecing together the distinct segments in your head is how the player's cognitive load is taxed. A fun substitute from the usual affair of having loopy level design. Another fun thing to consider with this place is how there aren't shortcuts here, barring the return to the start at the very end, and how long it is. Maybe the longest level in the entire game. So while it doesn't starve the player of resources anywhere near as much as Latria 3-1 did, the pacing of escalating tension is still present from there because there's no reduction of difficulty via shortcuts anywhere until you finish it. The objective is to collapse the brain of Mensis, and you do so by killing the prisoner enemies who are magically holding it up. But those guys aren't located in out-of-the-way pockets that you can avoid if you die and already completed it. They're plopped right into the mandatory path. If you die after killing the first group, you cannot make progress unless you route right through their location again, because that spot is a choke point, like every other part of the linear path is. Progress is preserved, you only need to kill each group once, but because they aren't a challenge to fight and because they aren't in an out-of-the-way location, progress might as well not be preserved, because only the actual killing of the prisoner is removed from the route. The brain of Mensis, actually the heart of Latria, I've theorized to be a sort of artificial old one. It creates the man-centipede demons and perhaps the gargoyles and the man-eater, and it probably does so by having souls fed to it. In the Soul Society items and in other soul harvesting items found in Latria, there is a story told of how in this formerly learned land there was a group that believed in restricting the knowledge of the soul arts to members only. Yurt and Mephistopheles are members and target the NPCs who know how to manipulate souls or know about soul manipulation for assassination. Latria has been described by Miyazaki as being a place of man-made evil, and what I think he's getting at is how none of the torments and horrors that we have here could have come about if not for human intervention and organization. It's all structured and commanded over. What was once a learned land has been conquered by the old monk, and the institutions which at some point would have held the society together now all have to express his insanity and malice, and that comes through in the environmental design. The man-eater boss that caps off this section is probably the hardest fight in the entire game, and it can also be a bit janky because it sometimes feels like the man-eater's AI aren't communicating with each other. So when one attacks, you'd want the other one to perhaps softly de-aggro a bit to keep the fight to a one-on-one. I don't know if they are communicating or not, I just feel like if they are, they could do it a bit more. This place is distinct for a Demon Souls boss so far because this is the first time a boss has challenged us not to fall down. Dragon God did have heights to fall down from, but that wasn't the challenge in that boss in anywhere near the same way it is here. The Man-Eater's arena is an extension of the walkway in the rest of the gauntlet, and the boss will swoop down and try and knock you down. I like that. how the arena feels like an organic extension of the challenge in the rest of the map, and I also like how, like the Fool's Idol, the Man-Eaters seem to be an amalgamation of the enemies in the rest of Latria. Like the Mind Flayers, they have a Force Push AoE which can end the fight if you're poorly located when it goes off. They fly like the gargoyles do, so they are able to relocate themselves and quickly alter the best positioning the player should look out for, and like the man centipedes, the tail can be cut off. When they reposition themselves, they can be swallowed up in the ambient darkness, and to keep a track of them, you need to look out for the sinister glowing eyes poking through the dark. Latria 3.1 was an excellent horror sequence, and Latria 3.2 is as great, and I like how it accomplishes a lot of the same tension building without strictly using the same structure. S tier.
Latria 3.3 begins with a tight curving staircase leading into the boss arena.
This might have been padding for the sake of network connection. The boss is unique in that it summons the other players to fight as the champion of the yellow garb, and so an enclosed space, like the hallway here, and enemies that block it as effectively as the ones here do, extends the ascent duration and allows more time for the PvP to find an appropriate combatant. For that alone, I'd give kudos to the level design, but I also think this works to add a bit of anticipation to the fight, on both ends. So if you're the invader, you're summoned into the arena and have to wait until the other player makes their way towards you. If you're the host player, then the prelude has a bit of extra progress on the line. The boss arena itself is a bit strange. It is ostensibly a fairly open, mid-sized arena with a fun boss gimmick of summoning other players to fight you, but the visual of the stacked chairs leading to the throne is very fun. When we fought Dragon God, I talked about how the arenas in Demon Souls are much more integral to the bosses than they are in subsequent games. Much more so here, in this game, than any time later. It feels like the developers went above and beyond when designing the environments, maybe because the combat was still so simplistic, that the scenario would be made or broken not by the enemy you fought, as much as by the terrain you fought them in. It's easy to imagine early build play sessions having developers feel that the encounters needed to be more interesting, and the obvious choice being to vary up the terrain. If the combat were deeper, playtesting might not have urged the developers towards that same impulse. The boss here, the Old Monk, is the closest we get to a straight mirror match in the entire game, so the boss arena is the simplest one in the entire game. Breakable chairs act as clutter, but aside from that, this is a perfect arena for the kind of fight this is. The PvP aspect of Demon Souls, and the rest of the games as well, has never fully embraced the unorthodox geometry of these levels. There have been attempts at covenants and such to try and make the players integrate the environmental design more into the PvP experience, but, as far as I can see it, players hone in on locations where geometry is almost a non-factor, or it's still in the range of relatively unintrusive on the fight. Tight hallways means death to bad camera collisions. Cliff faces mean deaths to possible falling because the movement direction being relative to a camera angle that shakes and judders about the map to lock in on a target. Excessive clutter and geometry makes dodging harder because you can't always see perfectly behind you and you can get snagged on the environment. Those sorts of arenas do not inherently make for bad gameplay, but the kind of player who gets into PvP is statistically also going to be into builds and strategizing around that, and since eccentric environments create scenarios where some builds have an objective advantage, the arenas that players flock to, like I said, tend to be fairly open and non-busy spaces. Those do also select for objectively better ways to play and build, but at least they don't have the problem of losing because of weird camera collisions or stuff like that, anywhere near as much as those more eccentric environments do. If the encounters there feel sacky, at least it's sacky because the fighting felt unfair. PvP build versus PvE build. Shrine of Storms 4.1 begins with a skeleton-filled stairway leading to castle ruins, where we get another wonderful forked path where players are made to choose between dungeon crawling and an execution challenge. There's the open courtyard where the player can fight the Demon Vanguard again, as well as dodge air attacks from the Storm Beasts, and there's the underground path where players fight skeletons in tight hallways and keep their eyes out for traps. Afterwards, the forked path merges again on a cliffside area where skeletons try and block sections of the map off, as well as try and knock the player off the map, and then the player makes their way to the Adjudicator boss. The starting point of this place where we spawn at is a large open space leading to a doorway in a wall, and continuing on the talk from Latria 3.3, I remember this being a popular PvP spot back in the day, specifically because it's very early on after warping, so you don't need to spend a lot of time getting here, and because it's flat and devoid of clutter, so combat here can be a test of skill more so than anything else. But subsequent parts of this map are anything but, and Shrine of Storms 4.1 might have, pound for pound, the best enemy integration in any FromSoft level ever made. That is, both the choice of enemy, when considering the terrain, is above and beyond excellent, as well as the ways in which the encounters unfold. For example, when walking up the stairs after the opening flatland, the enemy aggro ranges are tuned such that pursuing a close-by enemy will likely trigger an enemy further ahead, and if you don't deal with the enemy close by fast enough, you can easily get swarmed by the skeletons, whose rolling speed is more than a match for the player. So running away isn't always possible. When a player sees some patrolling enemies, they usually take it as a given that moving towards them will have them notice the player when they cross into the fixed range of that specific enemy, but FromSoft often likes to have enemies in the back aggro first, so that before you even face off against the first enemy, you've already got another one coming your way. I love when they do this because it reinforces patience and situational awareness. There's nothing unfair about an enemy further back being the first to aggro. Provided you can wait the extra 5 seconds it takes for him to make his way to you, there's also no difference between aggroing him first or aggroing the closest by enemy first. It just makes things harder if you're running before you look. More examples of this in this gauntlet include the cartwheeling skeletons in the tight underground corridors. It's seen in the Storm Beasts, which will start raining spears at the player around the point they lock into the Vanguard mini-boss, and it's also seen in the numerous traps. You can rush a lot of this, but the game is asking you to look ahead. Shrine of Storms is a great moment to highlight a universal design choice across every gauntlet here. From both a story perspective and from a gameplay perspective, enemy placements in Demon Souls are top-notch. There are a questionable couple of placements across the game, like there always are, but the general choice of enemy type in a given location always feels right, and you get the sense that the environments might have been created around the enemies encountered in them. Elaborating a bit on the talk we had about Latria 3.3's boss arena, as these FromSoft games kept coming, combat became more a pronounced activity, and so enemy movesets got more complex. Here, enemies will have 2 or 3 attacks they can perform, and each one fits with how those enemies are placed in the world. So a fat official has a whip attack, a short-range fire explosion, and a longer-range fire projectile, and they tend to be placed near explosives, so the challenge with them is to get close enough to deal damage, while being careful not to get cooked. The skeletons in the Shrine of Storms have the bone wheel fast rolling at the player gimmick, and are often placed in narrow corridors, so that you can't get around them and need to avoid them and wait for them to become vulnerable. It makes you reactive, not proactive. The fights are not complex because of attack patterns or timing windows, but because your placement in the map relative to the enemy matters, and you are constantly rewarded for using your brain in fights. Across the entire Demon Souls experience, the name of the game when it comes to enemy encounters is situational awareness. In later games, since the enemies get more complex, each one can be slotted fittingly into more than one location. But the issue that creeps up there is that since they are as complex as they are in those later games, fighting an enemy is often a self-contained experience. And so the environments aren't always configured in a way to direct the fighting to congeal to a certain emotion or optimal strategy. And situational awareness stops being the universal guiding principle for enemy placements, and instead becomes a sometimes thing. Sometimes you need to pay attention to your environments, but not always. Because of this, in spite of the more complex and polished combat systems in those later games, the pound-for-pound quality of utilization is rarely matching what Demon Souls was putting out. The story of this place, going back to the soul arts manifest the beliefs of humans, because the soul is connected to clarity and the mind and its contents. The Shrine of Storms was the land of the Shadowmen who seemed to worship death, and the gauntlet is their death ritual. According to the lore of this place, the dead begin their journey in the afterlife by facing judgment from the Adjudicator, and so it's the very first boss of the Shrine of Storms. And it's one of the best bosses in the game. When you enter its domain, you see the health bar of the boss, but not the boss itself. He can attack you, but you'll struggle to attack him. And if you don't move, then the boss will attack you from underneath where you can't see him. So the immediate test is to get visibility on the boss. In a way, this is the opposite to how the Grave Lord Nito encounter works, where you were asked to stand still after getting into the arena to not aggro all of the mobs. The Adjudicator boss itself is not that hard. You just stay near the left arm and attack him where the Butcher's knife shard is sticking out after he attacks. But since the boss is so big and the area you fight him in is so cramped, you can screw yourself if you don't pay attention by getting yourself tucked in a corner and not being able to navigate around the boss. This is a unique kind of challenge which they haven't really returned to in any of their games. The actual physiology of the boss makes navigating the narrow space very, very difficult. A similar boss, I guess, would be the Rotten in Dark Souls 2, but the environmental snagging there wasn't a function of the room being too tight, but there being pools of fire which damaged the player when they stepped on it. Those varied up the terrain some, but that fight didn't quite match the challenge we have here with the Adjudicator, since the Rotten's physical size isn't as imposing on your movement options as the Adjudicator's is. If you position yourself poorly against the Rotten, you might need to run in fire for a bit and take some damage. If you position yourself poorly against the Adjudicator, you either Hail Mary dodge your way through the next attack he throws at you, or you're dead. I've harped on about boss arena designs in this video a lot, and I want to repeat that I think the commitment to the encounters and the confidence in the showcase is much greater here than it ever would be for a FromSoft game again. Failure here carries a larger cost than in subsequent games, since you'll need to redo the boss run, and because of the tendency system, and the loss of max health, and the loss of your spent resources. That's not to say this game's approach to design should have been reincorporated in later titles. They often pushed towards new ideas that were better realized with different systems and design approaches, just that I think this makes Demon's Souls so very, very special. Shrine of Storms 4-1, S tier. Shrine of Storms 4-2 is a vertical descent all the way through, but unlike Stonefang 2-2, there's not a forked path separating two distinct ways of getting through the environment. It plays more like Latria 3-2, tight spaces and linear progression, but whereas that map was characterized by darkness and fall danger, this map bounces between precarious cliffs and tight hallways with not a lot of room to maneuver. The skeletons from 4-1 return on the cliff faces to knock you off and block progress. The new enemies are the Reapers and the Shadow Lurkers. The Shadow Lurkers can be hard to spot if you don't pay attention and can deal a lot of damage, both from close-up physical attacks as well as long-range laser beam attacks. Killing the Reaper in a given area will despawn all nearby Shadow Lurkers, so the Reapers are sometimes hiding, helped out by their black attire. So on one hand, you have an enemy that can kill you quickly if you don't stay mobile. On the other, you can dispose of all of them at once by staying mobile after you find their corresponding Reaper. At the end of Stonefang 2-3, I talked about my love of cliffs, and this is a reoccurring point I'll be bringing up as this level design of From Software series progresses. If an otherwise meh area has one of these cliff sections, I will regard it more favorably. For though it may have sucked, at least it had a good cliff. The ones here in Shrine of Storms 4-2 have choices for the player to make, and if you're anything like me, you've tried to squeeze all the depth you can from the game's mechanics, and if you are anything like me, this place is a highlight partly because you did a bunch of your experimenting here. I often feel like these games are lacking for a sort of utilitarian class character. Someone who lives off the land and uses what he has at his disposal, rather than someone who levels up into powerful weapons and magics. There are always a lot of fun extra mechanics stapled to the experience in these games, like throwing knives, alluring skulls, rocks for noise, enemy visibility cones which can be manipulated by geometry, etc. But Demon Souls, maybe because it is so much more bare bones than its follow-ups, is the one modern From game, aside from, I feel, Sekiro, where the impulse to use these extra mechanics is triggered in me. In Boletaria, I use firebombs to deal with the hoplites faster. In Stonefang, I use sticky white stuff to magically imbue my sword to tear through the stone scale miners quicker. In Latria, and here in the Shrine of Storms, I like the Thieves' Ring for undermining enemy sightlines and overcoming the danger of the projectile attacks that otherwise have the potential to end a run in one hit. It even feels appropriate considering the final boss of this place is blind, and the point of that fight is masking your presence. Now, that's technically not a celebration of the level design, it's just a thing I appreciate about Demon Souls. For the level design, Shrine of Storms 4.2 excels at something I didn't mention in Boletaria 1.1, in Latria 3.1, or Shrine of Storms 4.1, even though it was relevant in all of those areas, which is the counterplay of cramped inside spaces and open outside spaces. For the flow of the gauntlet, this does a lot, but it's also interesting to think about how, once again, we're dealing with the feeling of difference more than the reality of difference. Because, yes, some of the interiors here are quite cramped, and some of the exteriors are quite open. But it's not universal. Many of those interiors here are quite open. They're just covered in shadows, and the paths are often very tight, so it feels cramped. For the exteriors, the Storm Beast projectile attacks means dangers are always around the corner. Some even sneak their way past the Thieves' Ring, believe it or not. And this means the large open environments here are functionally better thought of as being cramped, since you constantly have to ward off the large skeleton enemies who block progress with their bodies, Adjudicator style, and who roll towards you, forcing a retreat or dodge, all the while your sights are exposed to the Storm Beasts. If you look at the physical layout of these open spaces, yes, they are open, but the way we're made to play through them, the impositions on mobility and challenges the enemies provide, functionally transform them into cramped spaces. One more thing I'd like to bring up in the open exterior versus cramped interior discussion is how small the walkable surface area here is. I haven't done any science to back this up, but I wouldn't be surprised if this level has the smallest footprint in the entire game if we only look at the walkable footprint, outside of maybe some of those Archdemon boss arenas. But I don't feel like this place is particularly small, and partly it's because, like Latria 3.2, the path may be small, but it's not 2 or 3 arenas which connect together, it's drawn out hallways. Long and narrow instead of wide and open, so navigation still takes time. But I think another reason it doesn't feel small is because we dip in and out of the catacombs on a regular basis. The transition from these very, very different feeling environments at the rapid pace we transition through them, I think helps mask how short the journey here might actually be. Shrine of Storms 4.3 is a short path to an open shrine area. A Shrine of Storms, if you will. 4.3. Like the previous Archdemon boss arenas, this is a fairly small environment to be considered a full level, and like the best boss arenas in the game, this one utilizes the space and how we navigate and maneuver through it to create a compelling and memorable experience above just having a circular room to roll and stab in. It all begins when the player gets here and explores a bit to find the Storm Ruler, a sword which, in this area and no other, will generate a massive projectile attack when it is swung, and this is the method players are intended to use to deal with the Storm Beasts and the Storm King boss. One thing about the challenge here that I'd like to talk about is how this is the apex of the entire game at having the player angle the camera upwards. We've been doing this here and there all throughout the Shrine of Storms, but it's the main mode of engagement for the central challenge here, and it's a very, very different kind of play from anything else in the game. I love my gimmick bosses, this is up there with the best of them, and is still the best example yet of this gimmick. Yorm, Rykard, and Maris simply don't compare. The spectacle in those fights can easily be argued to eclipse what we have here, but I feel there's something about the atmosphere which Demon Souls has a handle on, and subsequent games seem to have a harder time with. Partly the lengthy run back could be the contributing factor. When you have more progress on the line, you tend to slow down and move more methodically. You invest yourself deeper in the run, dare I say you immerse yourself more in the experience, but the bosses I just named all have longer run backs than the Storm King does, so that can't be the whole story. Another contributing factor might be how much more silent Demon Souls is than its successors. Fewer character interactions, fewer loud moments or moments that break up the tension. Dark Souls 1 had a good rhythm and has more uninterrupted playtime than Demon Souls did, but the bonfire placements there are tension release valves and are, for the most part, more generously spaced out than the checkpoints in Demon Souls. That makes sense considering that game's ambitions for an experience where the player gets lost in the world, but it does, I would argue, come at the cost of runs becoming shorter and thus tension and atmosphere suffering. Atmosphere is one of those nebulous and hard to begin to quantify terms that's often thrown around when discussing level design in games, and different things work for different people. I like the long, quiet time, where my experience remains unbroken by the developer wanting the camera to look a certain way and overriding my control over it. If you want me to look at something, have my guy organically face it when he enters a place, like the entrance to Leyndell, where we get a look at the corpse of Grandsax. I'm also a big sucker for a strong diegetic soundscape. Remember those Metal Gear Solid commentaries I started but didn't finish up on? Well, if I had, you'd have heard me talk about this extensively in the Snake Eater commentary. As chatty as that game can be, when it decides to hand you the controls, it does not interrupt you or try and shove its script in your face. It's just you and the relatively quiet tropical jungle of Russia. Sure. And the sounds you heard were bugs and birds chirping, streaming water and things like that. Demon Souls is much more reserved with its story than Snake Eater, obviously, and it's very comfortable giving you an hour or so of playtime where no character even talks to you. The challenge here is avoiding death by the Storm Beast projectiles in an environment that does not have a lot of cover, has some though, and it's also in footwork. So because the enemies are all airborne, you need to look up to take them out. But oh no, now you don't have a clear view of the map anymore and can get snagged on clutter, can fall between elevations and even fall off the map entirely. Winding up an attack from the Storm Ruler takes a bit of time, and if you mistime it, you can miss the enemies or get interrupted by a projectile during the wind-up. On the Storm Ruler, it's very clear that they intended for this encounter to feel different, and so the player was gifted a weapon with a unique property to fulfill the intended fantasy here. A small tacked-on mechanic such that all builds have a shot at the boss and not just those that honed in on ranged attacks. A novel solution to the problem of playstyles and core gameplay being too restricted to express with the boss what they wanted to express. The Storm Ruler is such an essential component of this fight that I wouldn't be surprised if the boss were designed around it rather than the other way around. If it was just a tool to help melee builds bridge into a ranged attack boss, then it's an incredible success or failure depending on how you think about it, considering the sword is more iconic and a bigger piece of the boss's success story than anything else in the encounter, including the boss itself. The Dragon God had a similar problem as the Storm King does, in that the conventional gameplay would not work to take him down, so a new gimmick was introduced in the environment to make it playable: the ballistas. Those were environmental features, whereas the Storm Ruler is a weapon you can wield, and so it feels a lot more organic. But I wonder if the different feelings people have with those two bosses might actually be down to the presentation of the takedown. You defeat the Storm King by equipping a magical sword and overcoming the execution challenge. You defeat the Dragon God by activating 2 cutscenes. Maybe, if the ballistas had to be aimed like the bow and arrow can be, it would rank higher with people.
Thematically, the Storm King is the manifestation of Sky Burial, and it's an incredibly well-made and mechanically rich boss.
One of the game's best, one of the studio's best, I feel. Shrine of Storms 4-3, S tier. The Valley of Defilement 5-1 is a dimly lit wooden shantytown hanging from rocky surfaces, dangling over a pit. The player's objective is to navigate the narrow environment filled with holes and cliffs to fall through and from, and eventually make it to the Leechmonger boss in the pit. Since this is the final world we'll be visiting, it maybe bears noting how incrementally the trend of insta-kill death falls has been increasing all throughout. It's not a perfect arc. Latria 3-2 has more fall danger than Shrine of Storms 4-2, but the overall trajectory, at least in the first parts of the gauntlets, has ramped this up. Meaning the simple act of moving through the environments has become executionally harder. If there is any logic behind the sequencing of the Archstones, I'd argue above any other that this was it. Not an evolving understanding of the world, not a ramp up on the themes of the places to explore, but simply how much risk there is in the movement. More risk means later placement. For the record, Valley of Defilement 5.1 does not have a lot of cliff action. Even though the geometry and the challenge veers close to what FromSoft cliffs deliver, it's not the same thing, so my love of cliffs will not be influencing the assessment here. On the topic of movement, the input system in this game is a bit clumsy, with directional changes from a linear forwards momentum always having a jerk to them. That is to say, when you're moving in a straight direction, it always feels like you gotta jiggle the joystick a bit further than 1 degree to an adjacent direction for it to register that the player's facing direction has changed. In fact, it feels like there may be a 15 to 20 degree lock in both directions at all times. It's that extensive. When you're in the process of turning, so long as you don't lock into a single direction, you unlock the smooth direction change. If this is intentionally placed, I figure it's because of areas like the Valley of Defilement 5.1 where there are a lot of pitfalls, so that once you start moving and commit to a direction, you can be confident that forwards momentum will be preserved since there's a dead zone for changing the facing direction. The other reason I figure this might be is that it might be that the game was originally formatted around D-pad movement, and the dead zone exists as a sort of legacy component of octagonal facing directions. In that case, I struggle to explain why the facing directions smooth out when a new facing direction has been locked in, so I'd put the odds of octagonal movement being legacied in as low, but not impossible. The aggressive motion dead zone is a strange design choice, and I'd say that if Demon's Souls has a fundamental flaw, one that I cannot rationalize with appeals to atmosphere experience or as being a compromise to support some other mechanic whose inclusion was so important that compromise in another area was justified, if there is a flaw with Demon's Souls, the jerky dead zone movement is it. The way around it, when precision is desperately needed, is to move the player character forwards at a snail's pace and then slowly turn the camera while holding the left analog stick slightly forwards. Camera movement is smooth, and its smooth motion properties can be leveraged to fix the walking in this game. The enemies in the Valley of Defilement 5.1 return to being overwhelmingly just scrubs, like in Boletaria, and instead of more varied and expressive movesets, though there's a bit of that here and there and some added enemy variety, the main challenge is not in overcoming the enemies, it's doing so and avoiding poisons and plagues. There's a vendor in the old crone who sells curing lotuses at crazy markups, so worst case scenario you can always backtrack to her provided you have the souls. I've talked a lot about my love of the healing grass system over the years, and what I always come back to as the biggest pro, though not the only one, is that since it costs resources, each run is a bigger commitment than in, say, Dark Souls, where healing is free. Yes, you can use humanity there as a more expensive healing choice, but like life gems in Dark Souls 2, when you have both the free and the expensive healing systems, I feel you undermine the big strengths of both more than you supplement the weaknesses of each. And yes, Demon's Souls has crazy max stock on healing items, and yes, nobody likes farming the stuff. A design choice can have positive reverberations on an experience while also having some imperfections and flaws. Estus, for example, softly standardized gauntlet lengths and erased the bumps of buying healing items and farming from the Dark Souls experience, allowing you to act as a more independent agent in the world and getting lost in it more deeply than otherwise. And it also freed the devs from placing vendors all over who sold healing items or enemies who dropped it. But it also removed healing nearly entirely from the environmental design. In Demon's Souls, you saw a glimmer of light behind an enemy when you were desperate, and that glimmer could be healing. In Dark Souls, it probably wasn't, bar humanity. Also, Estus reduced your investment in a given run and made retreading free. The resources you risked in a run in Demon's Souls do not regenerate. I relitigate this argument for the millionth time on this channel, not because I had anything new to say about it, but because the Valley of Defilement is a good showcase, conceptually at least, for why I prefer grass. Zoomed out, the lotuses act a lot like grass in that these are limited-ish resources that you can spend if you fail the central challenge. Usually that's combat and healing. Here it's that, and also exploration and afflictions, plagues and poisons. And since these are slower, more silent killers, they must be worked around differently than we do to losing health normally. If you're very deep into a run when the affliction hits, it might actually still be a good idea to proceed because it kills you very, very slowly and you might find a shortcut. It also puts you on a timer to complete the gauntlet if you don't have the resources to thuck the affliction out. I think I talked about this maybe in the Armored Core 3 analysis video, about how a timer alters the context in which a mission is presented, and even if it is very forgiving in its duration, it nudges players towards haste, and that shakes up the way they go through the place. A slight alteration to the baseline experience, and all of a sudden, everything feels tense in such a different way. The boss arena integrates the wooden shantytown aesthetic well, with the fight beginning with a path leading down to the Leechmonger's lair. Considering how the gauntlet which preceded the Leechmonger's pit had this big emphasis on status ailments, it's funny to think that some players might have died here not due to the boss, but because of the path to the boss being as long as it is. I'm not sure that was the intention, or if it's long to give the Leechmonger the chance to deal some projectile damage before you reach it. Whatever the case, I'm a fan. Valley of Defilement 5.1, S tier. The early portion of the Valley of Defilement 5.2 is the game's main swamp area, so the rules for level design and scenario direction are completely different. The swamp section wraps up in a choke point to a smaller swamp, and then a wooden bridge and shantytown sequences. Because of the first swamp, I'd guess this level has the largest footprint in the entire game when we account only for terrain that can be traversed. There are better and worse ways of navigating the swamp, and there are also risks and rewards for deviating from that. A lot of the directorial techniques from Valley of Defilement 5.1 remain here, so status ailments, darkness, simple enemies, dangers of falling, etc., but the revamped framing, like I went over with how a timer can change everything, the revamped framing here from 5.1 makes this gauntlet feel very different. Something you'll often hear is how people want games to have more meaningful choices, that your decisions as a player should matter and have consequences. But when those consequences are presented as dying and losing all of your held resources in a dark swamp and not unlocking a secret cutscene, people often don't like having consequences in their games anymore. Valley of Defilement 5.2 is the original modern FromSoft swamp level, and dare I say it's still the best one. These places are different in kind to every other sort of gauntlet because they always have a status ailment afflicted on the player, and so the challenge is to either touch as little of the terrain as possible or to body the ailment and rush the challenge on a ticking timer. These areas are very hit and miss with people because they are such a departure from the conventional mode of playing and because different people want different things from these swamps. People debate how quickly the afflictions should catch the player, how long they should last, how much damage, if any, they should deal, what sort of other kind of ailment these swamps could impose on the player, so limited movement, like the lack of rolling here, reduced max stamina recovery, reduced stamina recovery rate, no reduction in health but increased damage taken while afflictions last, etc. And hitting the correct balance is impossible because, again, people want different things. Story-wise, the swamp areas, so Valley of Defilement 5.2, Blighttown, the cave underneath Josefka's clinic, Farron Keep, Sunken Valley, Lake of Rot, etc., all of these represent the idea of a stagnant, corrupting impurity. These places are deep below, and they are where filth moves to, stagnates, and rots. Trying to convey that idea while also making for an immersive area is hard, and the reason I think the Valley remains the best one of these locations is because it hit the perfect notes for me at conveying this theme. Rather than highlighting the visual degradation like the other noted examples all do, Valley of Defilement 5.2 is barely visible. Rather than elaborate combat challenges, 5.2 is almost entirely empty. Rather than have an empty path to open up, like the Lake of Rot, 5.2 has a shortcut in the beginning, but the swamp remains undisturbed. Damage scaling, resistances, these things are endlessly debatable, but for what these swamp levels aim at, representing the idea of impurity, stagnation, and rot, I think this is the best we've ever seen. I did an entire video on Kegare, or impurity, which I'd recommend watching if you haven't already. One more thing to note about how it relates to these swamp areas is how the afflictions and the reduced mobility options create a natural aversion to being in the impure lakes. You step in it because you have to, but you sort of instinctually beeline to the next pocket of safety, kinda simulating a disgust impulse, which is very apt. This gauntlet will feature the final example of a major progression path forking, and it's different from every other area because there's no checkpoints separating the competing paths. You can do the easy path and then dip halfway through, or vice versa. The way it's set up is that the main path has lit up islands which house enemies, and then the swamp is emptier, but because of reduced mobility and because of poor visibility and status ailments, has a different sort of challenge. But not an execution challenge like we usually have in these forking paths. If anything, swamp walking is testing resource management. Every area in Demon's Souls has a main resource associated with it, the thing you loot in that area. So in Boletaria it was healing grass because the enemies were soldiers. In Stonefang it was different kinds of ore because it's a mining area and the enemies were by and large miners. In Latria it was spice because Latria was once a learned land that studied the soul arts, and the primary enemies there, the mind flayers, used magical attacks against the player. In the Shrine of Storms it was souls, because the area was a catacomb built by those who ritualistically worshipped death, and the enemies were skeletons, sky burial storm beasts, ghosts, and reapers, signifiers for death. The Valley of Defilement is the Kagare area, so purifying lotuses that heal status ailments are the primary resource. In every area, health items matter, but like I went over in 5.1, the lotuses are also used to mitigate the penalty for failure, but because it's different in kind from the healing grasses, Valley of Defilement is the only area wherein 2 resource types are central to the navigation, outside of some build-specific resource dependencies like spices for soul arts users. What that means is that, more so than any other area in the game, the gauntlets in the Valley of Defilement can use in-world loot to entice the player, because the player needs more items to make it through here. I don't want to relitigate the whole grass healing debate, since I already converted most of you already, I think. But in Demon's Souls, since healing and looting are so connected, the items which are strewn around the world are, generally speaking, more valuable for every kind of build than they would be in subsequent games. When the player sees a white light indicating loot in the distance here, they're more incentivized to pick it up than in subsequent games, because they can make a much more reliable gamble that it's healing resources which they might be in dire need of. In Valley of Defilement 5.2, the only signposting we have are the item lights and torches, which from a distance can look very similar, and the choice to highlight all items with the same white flame effect means looting is always a bit of a gamble. You don't know what you're gonna get, so every loot might be worth it. Maybe not the deepest thing in the world, but there is something to being low on resources, seeing a light and having a short pause to talk yourself into or out of risking it, and that could not have been achieved if the items were signposted more elaborately as what they are. The latter half of the level has some precision movement across the wooden bridges leading to the shantytown before the Dirty Colossus boss. The Leechmonger from 5.1 was an amalgamation of leeches animated by a demon's soul, and the Dirty Colossus is a physical manifestation of accumulated filth and impurities forming together into a giant seedbed of rot and corruption. Both of these bosses share something interesting with each other, and the status ailments and swamps in these gauntlets that I just went over, which is that they simulate the disgust impulse. They have attacks that make the player impure and limit mobility. These bosses are very often overlooked because they're so easy, but if they were harder, then this aspect of their design might have gone unnoticed, or felt like a clumsy way to artificially increase their difficulty. If the ailments were harsher, they'd maybe feel like too deep deviations from the conventional gameplay to feel fair, but because these are too easy bosses, attaching this to them works well to have them convey the theme of the area, and even though they aren't very complex or difficult, this alone makes them deserving of more love than they usually get from the community, I feel. But your mileage may vary. Like I said earlier, different people want different things, and it applies beyond the swamp levels. To me, this area is S tier, though. Valley of Defilement 5.3 is a short cliff sequence blocked off by the Garl Vinland fight, leading to the final confrontation with the area boss, Maiden Estrella, sitting in an impure lake. This is routinely brought up as one of the highlight moments in Demon's Souls by fans, and while I agree with the sentiment and think the uniqueness of the encounter makes it a highlight not only in the game but across all of FromSoft's games, old and new, I think people sometimes take their appreciation of this area and allow it to lead them to bad impulses for encounter design writ large. It feels right that when designing a game, you'd want to nut out the basics of gameplay and then spend the majority of your time creating these sorts of unique moments. But in disciplined level design, the most mundane elements are always going to get the most attention. That's the angle which walls are allowed to jut out the ground from to not be scalable or read as scalable. It's doorway collisions and optimizing them for smooth camera transitions between rooms, avoiding snagging and the like. The reason this mundane stuff gets the most attention is because you will interact with that stuff 1,000 times in a playthrough. The hero pieces, the big memorable parts of the maps, like the Old King Doran encounter in Boletaria 1.1, like the Gem Lizard Nest in Stonefang 2.2, the Ballista in Latria 3.1, the Luminous Snail Water in Shrine of Storms 4.2, or the Snail-Covered Moonlight in Valley of Defilement 5.2. These are always going to be more memorable, but they couldn't by themselves salvage a game which got the fundamentals feeling wrong. Hero set piece is another hard to quantify term, but you probably have an instinctual sense for just what I'm referring to here. A justification I could give for why the areas that I listed are these sorts of hero set pieces would be that they are completely different sorts of areas tucked inside of another area, and they often provide a very different kind of activity to engage in, which feels like it's cobbled together with more care and personality than the conventional encounters and scenarios are, which mostly have to pilfer and remix tricks from the same grab bag of scenario scripting tools. Nothing else in the game feels like the encounter with Old King Doran. He challenges the player to a fight, and then, when the player has proven themselves, he stops and lets them take the Demon Brand without further conflict. The Gem Lizard Nest in Stonefang 2.2 is hinted at all the way back at the beginning of Stonefang 2.1, and for an area concerned with ore, finding that place is like hitting the mother lode. An easy way to collect a lot of valuable resources. The Ballista in Latria 3.1 is remarkably similar to the arrow traps in places like Shrine of Storms, but it's a permanent barrage with a much larger range, dealing much more damage. Where else are you allowed to skip half the gauntlet by rolling 4 times? And that shortcut in Shrine of Storms 4.1 doesn't count. The Luminous Snail Water in 4.2 is a hero set piece because there's no other area like it. The exploding fireballs in Stonefang are very similar to the soul bombs here functionally, but they aren't moving on the same sort of delicate and deliberate paths through their environment. The shallow water with the snails is already a weird visual, and that all you need to do in this area is not get yourself blown up or killed by the snails, who are scrubs, so you probably aren't going to have that happen anyway, makes this a sort of serene meditative interlude from the rest of the Shrine of Storm 4.2 Gauntlet and the boss fight with the old hero. As for the Moonlight in Valley of Defilement 5.2, visually is quite distinct. The Moonlight Greatsword in all of its glory is covered in snails, attracted to its light. The challenge is a wooden bridge ascent, on brand for the Valley of Defilement, and then needing to collapse the mass of souls and then go down again to pick up the sword. It's a cool set piece. The most important thing about Valley of Defilement 5.3, when we're looking at the game design, is probably that this scenario follows the logic of hero set pieces much more than it does boss fights. Demon Souls' bosses are already more about mood than they are execution challenges, but Astraea takes that up to 11. Garl Vinland blocks off access to Astraea, and he can be tough until you figure his timing out, but once he's dealt with, Astraea offers up her soul for free. Funnily enough, the gauntlet before this one had the Moonlight, and it attacks clean through shields, so it's a good weapon to bring to the fight against Garl Vinland, since you'll no longer need to bait out his attacks and time your parries to take him out. If you try and get around the intended challenge and bolt it to Maiden Astraea by bypassing Garl Vinland, you'll almost certainly catch the plague from the water, and it'll likely catch up with you before you can fully take her out. So you'll both have to avoid his insane damage output while having reduced mobility because of the swamp, and also need to heal or cleanse yourself from the plague, leaving yourself exposed. Don't get me wrong, you can get this to work, but it's probably easier to just fight Garl Vinland the intended way. Something I always bring up in the Valley of Defilement is how Maiden Astraea is not mending the pain of the land. She's removing the souls of those who suffer, so that their minds slip and they can no longer fathom their suffering. Miyazaki has explained how, whereas Latria was a place of man-made evil, the valley is natural evil. So the bosses are manifestations of Keikare. Again, check out my Themes of FromSoft video on that one. Another point on this is something I've never given much thought to, but If the physical world is partly being shaped by the will of the souls who inhabit it, it might be that the suffering in the valley is amplified by the beliefs of the church crusaders here. So, because they have internalized penance and pain as the will of God, because they believe that they've been abandoned, maybe they amplify the suffering with their very presence. Food for thought.
Boletaria 1.3 continues the Boletaria tradition of having the challenge
be a clean, straight shot from the beginning to the boss. There's a 90-degree angle turn to the left right at the start here, but then the path is fairly straight and pronounced. But, like the other Boletaria gauntlets, gates and enemies and obstacles block this simple path off, such that you need to wrap your way around a more complex gauntlet before making it from the beginning of the central path to its end. Although this is technically not mandatory as the beginning of the final gauntlet, since you can run through this place as soon as you've killed your first archdemon, I always save the Boletaria 1.3/1.4 dual package for the endgame, and I feel like the difficulty scaling nudges players to that approach. Also, that the final levels of Boletaria are locked away behind an archdemon being killed, kinda in and of itself tells players that there's something behind here which should not be attempted yet. And also, story-wise, it makes the most sense since the conclusion to Boletaria 1.4 and the revelation about True King Alant in the finale are such a good contrast, and it hits harder the closer those two sequences are to one another. If any of the Archstones has greatness built into it by default, it's Boletaria. Not because Castle is automatically an interesting environment to explore, but because unlike the other zones, aside from the majority of Latria, I guess, this area is almost entirely human-made. And when you're freed from the restrictions of naturally forming geometry, you can do more with the geometric layout of the place you have the player navigating. Every wall angle can be justified in this biome, not so much for every other. A sharp 90-degree turn is gonna look correct here in a way it won't in a burrow or tunnel. In my urban exploration video, I brought up how level design has roads and walls. That is to say, components which facilitate movement and components that limit movement. To make any sort of progress in Demon's Souls, you have to change Boolean values governing obstacles. A gate is closed, open the gate. An elevator is inactive, activate the elevator. A boss is alive, kill the boss. Demon's Souls' gauntlets have a grounded and sensible approach to locks on progress, which its successors do not quite manage to replicate. A lot of the post-Demon's Souls shortcuts, for example, will be magical elevators. Later games are more fantastical, and so those aren't exactly out of place in their worlds, but Demon's Souls goes the extra mile to have their shortcuts and locks on progress feel real to the biome they're in. Boletaria is a castle, so its shortcuts are locked gates, like the main shortcut here in Boletaria 1.3, which the entire challenge is wrapped around. Once you've opened it, the gauntlet loses almost all of its footprint and turns into a short track to the Penetrator boss. In Stonefang 2.1, the big shortcut was the elevator at the start, which in-universe would have been used to ship ore across elevations. It even drops the ore off at the blacksmithy. And a lock on progress I like from that place is the small lava or molten metal pool we have to clean out. Ostensibly this is an insta-kill plane that you deactivate, but framing it as a lava pool makes it reflective of the environment wherein we find it. Latria 3.1 has the ballista, which we've talked about as the main shortcut, and Latria 3.2's elevators are cages. That's not to say that no area in later game did this sort of stuff. There are gates to open, elevators to activate, lava fields to drain, etc., even cage elevators. But here, in Demon's Souls, this feels innate to the level design, whereas in those later games, the challenges are a lot less about opening shortcuts and interacting with the environments to open up exploration, and a lot more about fighting the enemies. Demon's Souls shines in this department because the game is relying more on the level design to keep the experience going. Something else to consider here is how much lower to the ground Demon's Souls is in terms of magic. Yes, this is a world which has magic, but it didn't have it up until fairly recently. There are people you meet in this world who remember magic not existing, so the world design can't take magic for granted, quite like the Dreamlands in Bloodborne can, where reality is not as much a consideration. Or in Elden Ring, where magic is a fundamental building block of everyday life. Demon's Souls is more down to earth. Another reason Demon's Souls' world design might be tighter in this regard is that it is a smaller world to explore than what its successors have, so there would be fewer times where the developers would find themselves needing to glue together two parts of the map without massively overhauling the entire world layout. No gauntlets in Demon's Souls feel, to me, to have had a section of it moved or bent in order to make the level connect back in on itself. Because there's a choke point between every gauntlet that has no alternate route across the entire game crisscrossing into it, each level is a closed-off pocket, and the complexity contained therein is completely sealed off from the rest of the game. Meaning, you could decide on a basic layout and shortcut when designing these levels, and mostly stick to those choices from concept to realization. Whereas, in say Dark Souls, we know that certain areas only exist because they needed to glue some other areas together. Not to say that's a bad thing, but it means the shortcuts here and the warp point placements feel a lot more thought through, whereas often, in later games, you wonder why they bothered placing a shortcut when there was already a warp point right there. Something interesting about Boletaria 1.3 and 1.4 is how they mirror Boletaria 1.1 and 1.2. 1.3, like 1.1, is a complicated level wrapped around a central gate which must be opened to unlock progress. 1.4, like 1.2, is a straight shot from the beginning to the boss featuring no shortcuts. Also, both have you timing your movement around a dragon breathing fire down on you. 1.3, like 1.1, has a rolling, burning boulder trap. It has enemy ambushes. Those ones are in these cool, narrow alleyways. It has a courtyard at the beginning, which looks cool. The dog enemies fit well for an aggressive enemy that's not too hard considering how open the space is. The courtyard branches off to the optional path to Uria, which feels like it should be a world tendency event, but it's not. 1.3 has a great little pocket, which I can't explain, but I love. It's got a lot of choices, but it's very, very compact. Past the giant gate shortcut, they have the bridge path leading to the Penetrator boss. Throughout much of Boletaria, we've been chasing fat officials. We saw one in the Tower Knight boss fight, another one was responsible for closing the gate, and now we're poised to actually fight one as a boss, but he's murdered by the Penetrator at the start of the fight, and then the corpse is hurled towards us. The intro is not as iconic, perhaps, as Artorias is, and the fight isn't quite elaborate enough to scratch the execution challenge boss itch you might have if you're more acclimated to how boss design mostly works in subsequent games, but it's still a good challenge. Also, Bjor of the Twin Fangs shows up if you rescue him, and that's nice. Boletaria 1.3, S tier. Like I said, Boletaria 1.4 is kinda like 1.2 in that it's a more conventional, straight shot than an elaborate puzzle box where you open shortcuts to preserve progress across runs. In fact, there is no shortcut in the entire map, nor any progress to be preserved for subsequent runs. Aside from maybe killing Ostrava and if you kill the blue dragon. Those do not respawn, so if you get rid of them, subsequent runs are made easier, I guess. But not that much easier actually in the case of the blue dragon, since he gets rid of the fat officials for us, and avoiding the dragon fire is easier and quicker than dealing with those guys. Because this area is so long and culminates in the sort of boss it does with no shortcut to speak of, we can again bring up what we discussed in the Valley of Defilement about how small changes in the actual presentation can trickle down to big changes in the experience. Demon's Souls and Dark Souls 1 are the only games in the modern FromSoft library that commit to really darkly lit areas. The primary conceit behind the level and enemy encounter design in both games seems to have been, above all else, situational awareness. So both games push you, on your first go-through at least, when the challenges are unknown, to move slowly and be vigilant. Darkness in the environmental design, like we have in the Valley of Defilement 5.2, like in Latria 3.1 and 3.2, like the Tomb of the Giants, like in the Chasm of the Abyss and New Londo, my beloved, alters the player's experience. We're already being asked to take our time and pay attention, but now there's less visual information to work from, and so the tempo slows down immensely. I talked in the Valley of Defilement about how adding plague and poisons, adding a countdown to the experience, represented with the player's depleting health, can change the way that player processes the dangers ahead and what the best strategy is in a given moment. It is usually the case that retreating back to the Nexus is safe. Players lose resources they've spent on a given run, but they get to keep their souls. In the Valley of Defilement, if you're afflicted and low on resources, this calculation changes because you might not have what it takes to tread all the way back. So you have to risk either dying as close to the Nexus warp point as you can to recover your souls in the next run, or you can risk pushing through in the hopes that remedies to the affliction and or healing items might be up ahead. Changing the presentation changes the experience, often proportionally much more. Darkness can accomplish the same effect. Taking away the player's visual information can slow him down even more so than he already was, and tempo feels completely different and the tension gets heightened since each step has become riskier and has more time investment behind it. And if the player dies and needs to recover their souls, they'll have to do so with fewer resources and without having perfect recall of the environment because it was so very, very dark. In reality, that's not as big a problem as maybe it feels, because dark areas tend to not be all that labyrinthian. They often include some side tangents, but feed back to the main path, so players can probably get their stuff back by following any path in the darkness. But it feels more stressful, which is all that matters. There are darkness sequences here in Boletaria 1-4, in those towers with the assassins and night enemies, which are pretty fun moments, but to me, where 1-4 really shines is in a different context creates a different experience. There is no secret made that this is the last gauntlet. It opens with you having to re-kill every Boletaria boss in their black phantom form, and then the timing challenges with the dragon are probably the most demanding mandatory timing challenge in the entire game. When you have to bolt through the bridge, there's exploding barrels and other enemies who shoot fire projectiles at you. There's actually 2 of them. The hero set piece of the area would be the death of Ostrava and his subsequent Black Phantom invasion. The elevator ride to Alant, not a magic elevator by the way, you can see the guys on the walls cranking it up, is quite long, but more importantly, silent. Absolute quiet time before fighting the penultimate boss. This might be the hardest gauntlet in the game, and that, coupled with how it telegraphs itself as the finale, gives it a lot of character that changes the way I approach it. No matter how often I've played this game, this place always gets me in the zone, so to speak, and it's important to discuss how False King Alant is an execution challenge. It's the game's longest boss run, and to the game's hardest boss, one-off, which is sort of what you'd want from a game like this. One reason the runbacks have slowly become less important in these games is that as bosses have become more elaborate, there's more moves to remember and timing windows to master. And since that's the case, you die more often to them than you'd do to bosses like the Tower Knight and Leechmonger, whose entire moveset and gimmick you can download on your first run. More deaths to an area boss means more runbacks, and when those deaths stack up and are more owing to execution failures than failures of situational awareness, it gets frustrating. Nobody likes dying and losing progress, but when it's because you moved without thinking and fell into an obvious and avoidable trap, you can swallow that it's on you. When the death happened because the boss's attack window is delayed from the anticipation frames and triggered to auto-attack you in case of you rolling prematurely to 100% hit you, or because the boss pulled out an attack you'd not seen him do before and it chained into an 8-hit attack where every single hit in the chain is animated to communicate like it's the final attack to trick you into prematurely attacking, it's frustrating to die against the boss in a very different, harder to swallow way. False King Alant is an execution challenge, but his moveset is fairly limited, so while he's difficult, you'll probably download him on your first run still, or maybe on your second. It's worth pointing out how this sort of challenge, which has become the default in later games, was used so sparingly in this game. There's Flame Lurker, Old Monk, Garl Vinland, Penetrator, and False King Alant, and like 3 of these have more gimmicks going on which separates them from pure execution challenge. Artorias is the turning point, where they ironed out the kinks that made these sorts of bosses a bit hit and miss previously, and cemented that would be how they operated moving forwards. False King Alant could be thought of as a precursor to Artorias and later bosses. They have similar gimmicks, with the fight being about controlling distance to the boss, large open arenas to give you choices during their massive AoE attacks, chain combos, grab attack, it's all here in False King Alant. But Alant has more gimmicks piled on top of all of this. Yes, the place is wide because the player needs to be able to run to safety to avoid his AoE, but they can also just hit him while he's charging up and shut it down. Yes, he has a grab attack, but it de-levels the player. There's much to be said about how boss design in these games evolved, and if we're comparing False King Alant to something like Godric the Golden, then there are things that Godric does which lap the presentation we get from Alant purely in terms of polish, challenge, expressiveness, etc. Much has been done to build on top of the fundamentals laid out here. So when evaluating Demon Souls, the most notable thing about it, in spite of its primitiveness compared to its successors, or maybe precisely because of its primitiveness, is how fully formed and complementary all of its scenarios and the design choices feel. The bosses are simpler, but they are more memorable. The levels are smaller, but they have more minute-to-minute quality design. When all you have are the fundamentals, execution becomes everything, and the fewer bells and whistles you have to accommodate, the more focused that execution can be. Which is why I think Demon Souls has the best run of levels, not just in these games, but maybe of any game ever made. And Boletaria 1.4 is no exception. S tier. The final area in Demon Souls is the beach, where we find the Old One and confront True King Alant. It's an open area with no secrets to discover, and the only objective is to head inside the Old One and wrap the game up. In my Sekiro commentary, I talked about how these games flutter from either having final bosses which emphasize ambiance or spectacle. So, Slave Knight Gale, Sword Saint Ishin, Radagon, and Elden Beast, Consort Radahn, these are examples of bosses where the challenge is ramped up, and the satisfaction of concluding the experience is locked behind the skill test of defeating them. It is incredibly satisfying the first time you do, and there is something to an experience like, say, Sekiro. There's something to an experience like that concluding on such a difficult boss, since the entire ethos behind the design of that game was the clashing of katanas and survival at all costs, using everything at your disposal. Ishin fit the kind of challenge that game provided perfectly. That being said, I have always gravitated towards the more ambient bosses in these games. Yes, it's incredibly satisfying to defeat a boss that's as insanely difficult as some of these guys are, but when you're at the end of the game, the culmination of the entire experience, you don't need to ramp things up anymore. To me, the boss works better when you can sort of breathe it out and take your time, because it's not an execution challenge. It's the in-game representation of you putting the experience down until next time. So easy final bosses, I think, always land better, and none in the entire FromSoft library, modern or pre-Miyazaki, has ever hit as hard for me as True King Alant does. It's another worldly kind of encounter, and the level does a lot more to emphasize that than maybe you'd imagine on a first glance. It is completely devoid of enemies to fight but the final boss, and that's not been how the rest of the game plays out. All throughout, the experience has been nudging you towards situational awareness and careful movement, but none of those impulses register any utility in this area, so because its design does not congeal to the sensibilities you've been conditioned to bring with you everywhere you go, there's a disconnect which I think helps sell the othery nature of this environment. Even though ostensibly, this is just the beach. The Old One has been built up throughout the entire game, and what do you know, you don't even fight the thing, because the Old One is not a physical presence which can be overcome with strength alone. And walking into the interior of it, my god, it's such a good moment. Crossing the water, breaking the branches, and listening to True King Alant's final words. This is as good as it gets. S tier. As you can see, I think very highly of the level design of Demon's Souls. Before signing off, I want to let you know that the series is uploading on Patreon as fast as the videos are edited, and when this video went live, I had both the Dark Souls 1 and 2 videos up there at patreon.com/medievalmegaman. After my brief 2025 hiatus, I'm back to monthly video releases here. My hiatus was in service of just steaming ahead with the development of my game. I didn't finish it as I planned, but I'm so close now, and if you want to support that, I'd ask that you click the Steam page in the description box below and wishlist it. If it's out, maybe even buy it, but please just wishlist it for the algorithm magic. The Steam algorithm likes to recommend things that are already popular, so It's a lot like real life in that sense, and please don't, I'll do it later if you can. It takes like 10 seconds to wishlist the game, and it would mean a lot to me if you did. I am AesirAesthetics. See you in the next video.